Across the heart of Eurasia stretches a vast ribbon of grassland, reaching more than 6,000 miles from the plains of Manchuria to the distant edges of the Black Sea. It is a landscape without sharp boundaries, where the horizon drifts endlessly into pale sky and the wind becomes the closest thing to a constant companion. Here, the earth rolls gently in long, quiet waves, brushed by grasses that shimmer under changing light. In winter, the land stiffens beneath snow and ice. In summer, it opens into wide expanses of green. This was the world that cradled the earliest ancestors of the Mongols, a world defined less by settlements and walls, and more by movement, distance, and breath. On this steppe, the climate shaped every rhythm of life. Winters could drop to bitter cold, testing both animal and human endurance. Summers brought warmth, but also unpredictability, sudden storms and shifting pastures that demanded flexibility. There were few forests, few mountains, and fewer cities. Instead, the land spread outward, inviting travel and discouraging stillness. In such a place, survival meant learning to read subtle signs. The scent of grass after rain, the direction of migrating herds, the faint trace of a river beyond a low ridge. These details became the quiet language of the steppe, understood not through writing, but through observation passed from generation to generation. A calm discovery emerges here. Geography was not merely a backdrop, it was a teacher. In a land where resources were scattered and fragile, people learned to move lightly, to follow the seasons, and to respect the balance between humans and grazing animals. The steppe encouraged mobility, and in doing so, it encouraged freedom. Communities could not anchor themselves in stone or carve permanence into the earth. Instead, their homes were felted tents, jairs that could be dismantled, packed, and carried on the backs of animals. Existence itself became a journey rather than a fixed point. Rivers threaded quietly through this world. The Onon, the Kurlan, and the Tul, flowing like slender lifelines across the open grass. Around them, wildlife flourished: saiga antelope, wild horses, steppe wolves, and small burrowing creatures that dotted the plains. The great horse herds that would one day power Mongol armies first grazed here in silent cycles, living symbols of speed and resilience. Each animal, each blade of grass, was part of a larger ecological rhythm, a reminder that life on the steppe was both fragile and enduring. To the west, the land broadened into the Kazakh plains. To the east, it rose gently toward Manchuria. Southward stood the barrier of the Gobi Desert, harsh, wind-scoured, and unforgiving, while far to the north lay the Siberian forests. The steppe was a corridor between worlds, connecting civilizations that rarely saw one another. Long before empires rose, this quiet expanse formed a natural bridge across continents. It allowed ideas, goods, and people to drift slowly across distances, sometimes over centuries. Though the steppe seemed isolated, it was in truth a vast, unbroken highway. Here lies a second calm discovery. The openness of the land nurtured an openness of mind. Without mountains or walls to divide them, early nomadic groups developed fluid identities. Clans mixed, alliances shifted, and languages blended across wide distances. The steppe did not insist on borders. Instead, it encouraged connection. Even small encounters, shared water, exchanged livestock, or brief cooperation during migration, became threads in a larger tapestry of relation. In this subtle, wandering world, no single tribe held dominance for long. Power was temporary, like a camp pitched beneath shifting stars. The sounds of the steppe were gentle yet ever-present. The steady rhythm of hooves, the flutter of birds rising at dawn, the low whistle of wind moving through grass. Night brought deep stillness, punctuated by the distant call of wolves. Under the open sky, people learned to navigate by constellations, to measure time not in hours but in seasons, and to see themselves as part of a wider landscape that stretched beyond sight. Life here encouraged humility, a reminder that human ambition was small compared to the vastness of earth and sky. And yet, within this quiet expanse, a unique strength was forming. The steppe demanded adaptability, resourcefulness, and cooperation. It rewarded those who could move swiftly, make decisions without hesitation, and preserve knowledge without writing. These qualities, endurance, flexibility, mobility, would one day shape an empire unlike any the world had seen. But for now, they existed simply as the instincts of survival. A third calm discovery rests in this thought. The Mongol Empire did not begin with conquest or ambition. It began with the land itself. Its silence, its distance, its relentless teaching. Before warriors rode across continents, before leaders shaped law and strategy, the steppe shaped them. Its vastness nurtured a worldview where horizons felt limitless and movement felt natural. When later generations ventured outward, they carried the memory of this openness with them, like a quiet imprint of home. As the grasses swayed and generations passed, early Mongolic tribes learned to live in harmony with this landscape. They were not yet an empire, nor even a single people. They were scattered families and small communities, guided by seasonal paths and intimate knowledge of the land. The steppe remained their constant, unchanging in its magnitude, yet endlessly shifting in detail. And so, in this boundless world of wind and grass, the foundations of a future power quietly took root, not in stone or monument, but in the human spirit shaped by distance, endurance, and the endless horizon. As we follow the story forward, the land gives way to the people who journeyed across it, small clans and lineages whose fragile connections would one day become the first threads of a nation. Before an empire existed, what simple ties held its future together? Long before banners fluttered above conquered horizons, the Mongol world was a quiet tapestry of kinship. No cities marked their presence, and no monuments carried their names. Instead, the earliest Mongol communities lived as small, interconnected clans scattered across the steppe, bound not by walls or written laws, but by blood, memory, and the fragile trust of survival. In this vast openness, identity began not with a nation, but with a lineage, a family line stretching backward through story rather than stone. At the center of this early life stood the obak, the clan. Each clan was a circle of relatives who shared descent from a common ancestor, real or remembered. This shared root shaped everything: who a person married, whose herd they tended, and whom they could rely upon when winter winds swept across the grasslands. Lineage was more than heritage, it was safety. To belong meant protection. To stand alone was to face the steppe's indifference. In a world defined by distance, kinship created a small island of certainty. Within each clan, smaller family groups, households led by elders, carried the rhythms of daily life. A typical camp might include a handful of felt tents, known as gur or yurts, formed into a loose circle. Smoke rose gently from their roof holes, and animals grazed nearby under the watch of children and cousins. Authority flowed quietly through age and experience. An elder's voice held weight not because of rank, but because memory itself was a form of guidance, a living archive of migrations, storms, and past decisions that had helped the clan endure. Seasonal movement shaped their existence. Spring meant calving and foaling, a time of renewal when the grasslands stirred with life. In summer, herds ranged wider, and the steppe shimmered in heat. Autumn became a season of preparation, when families cured meat, mended saddles, and chose winter shelter. And winter, long, bitter, and sometimes deadly, tested every bond. A sudden blizzard could erase the horizon in moments. In such times, survival depended on calm cooperation, sharing fuel, pooling labor, and trusting that one's kin would not abandon them to the cold. One calm discovery emerges here. The Mongol Empire began not with conquest, but with the quiet skill of reading seasons, winds, and animal needs. Long before strategy, there was stewardship. Livelihood centered on pastoralism. Horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and sometimes camels formed the clan's wealth. Horses, especially, held a sacred practicality. They were transportation, sustenance, companionship, and a silent assurance that a family could move when it needed to. Children learned to ride before they were old enough to speak in full sentences, their small hands gripping warm manes as they absorbed the rhythm of motion. From these early practices grew the later mobility that astonished the world. But here, in this early era, it was simply life. Marriage served as one of the earliest bridges between clans. While many unions took place within allied groups, others were arranged to ease tensions or strengthen ties. Through marriage, the steppe's wide distances closed slightly, creating networks that extended beyond immediate bloodlines. This was another calm discovery. The foundations of Mongol unity were laid long before armies, through the gentle weaving of kinship ties. Even in times of scarcity, a shared wedding feast reminded families that companionship could soothe hardship. Leadership, though present, was modest. A clan might look to a chief or headman, someone respected for wisdom, negotiation, or bravery, but such leadership was less command than counsel. Decisions were often collective, shaped by fireside conversations and the measured voices of elders. Authority rested not in force, but in consensus. In this, early Mongol life teaches something subtle. Power first appeared as guidance, not domination. Yet cooperation was never effortless. The steppe was both generous and merciless, offering endless grass but little shelter. Shared grazing lands could spark quiet tensions, especially when herds grew large or winters ran long. Clans sometimes competed for water or pastures, their relationships swaying between alliance and rivalry. Still, violence was not constant. For most families, preserving harmony was simpler than risking bloodshed. The steppe encouraged caution, reminding all who lived upon it that distance magnified isolation, and isolation magnified danger. Spiritual belief softened the uncertainty of this world. Early Mongol communities honored the eternal blue sky and the spirits of the land. Shamans served as bridges between seen and unseen realms, offering guidance, healing, or ritual when illness or misfortune struck. These beliefs were neither elaborate nor rigid. They were woven into daily movement, a whispered thanks to a river, a quiet offering before a journey, a bow toward the open sky. In this humility lay another calm discovery. For the early Mongols, survival was a partnership with the world, not a conquest over it. Children absorbed this life slowly, learning through observation rather than instruction. They watched their elders choose grazing routes, prepare herds, settle disputes, and endure storms. Storytelling played a gentle role here. Around evening fires, ancestors were remembered, migrations recounted, and past hardships retold not as triumphs, but as lessons. Memory was the steppe's true library, carried from generation to generation through spoken words rather than written lines. Trade and contact with neighboring peoples were minimal but meaningful. A passing caravan or a chance meeting at a seasonal camp might bring tools, cloth, or news from distant lands. These interactions planted the earliest seeds of outward awareness. They hinted, faintly, that beyond the horizon lay other worlds, a thought that would one day shape an empire, though no one could yet imagine it. In these early centuries, life remained small in scale, but vast in meaning. Every migration, every herd, every shared decision reinforced the quiet truth that survival depended on unity. Even without a banner or a leader of renown, the clans carried within them the possibility of something greater, a latent strength held together by kinship, memory, and adaptability. And so, before the Mongol Empire existed, there were only families on the wind-swept plain, trusting one another against the cold. Their ties were simple, their tools modest, their world unrecorded. Yet within their cooperation lay the first faint outline of a future power. How can rivalry pave the way for unity? Across the great steppe, long before a single empire took shape, the land was divided into a shifting mosaic of tribes. They shared winds, horizons, and the same endless ribbon of grass, yet their identities stood apart. Each tribe carried its own ancestry, leaders, and quiet ambitions. Alliances formed like dawn mist, present for a moment, then gone, replaced by new bonds or fresh disputes. In this wide, open world, rivalry was not a disruption. It was the atmosphere itself, a constant presence that shaped every decision and every dawn. Among the most prominent of these peoples were the Tatars. Often positioned along the eastern fringes of the steppe, they became known as fierce competitors for territory and influence. Their camps dotted key pathways, controlling movement and trade between the interior grasslands and the lands beyond. To neighboring tribes, the Tatars were both obstacle and opportunity, a people skilled in mobility, negotiation, and at times calculated hostility. Chinese chronicles would one day describe them as a significant power, hinting at the quiet truth that the Mongols did not rise in a vacuum. They emerged from a landscape already filled with formidable actors. To the west and southwest lived the Karaits, a tribe with deeper political structures and a reputation for diplomacy. Their leaders, sometimes referred to as Khans, presided over more centralized authority, supported by networks of alliances that stretched beyond their own borders. Some Karait communities had early exposure to foreign religions, including forms of Nestorian Christianity, creating a spiritual layer distinct from their neighbors. Their territory included valuable grazing grounds and trade corridors, giving them influence that rippled outward. Calmly observed, the Karaits reveal a key insight. The steppe was not a realm of chaos, but a place where governance and belief were already evolving. Further west still, the Naimans held a reputation for strength and independence. Their name, echoing through later chronicles, evokes an image of a proud and capable people who maintained control over rich pastures and valuable mountain corridors. With leadership structures that supported unity in times of danger, the Naimans acted as a counterweight to rising powers around them. Their presence served as a reminder that the steppe was rarely dominated by a single force. Instead, it balanced itself through competing centers of influence, each wary of being overshadowed. The Merkids, though smaller in scale, played a meaningful role as well. Their identity lay in tighter-knit groups and strong traditions of family defense. Memory would later remember them through conflict, but in these early centuries they were simply one of many tribes navigating the delicate balance between autonomy and survival. Their alliances shifted frequently, as did their relationships with neighboring clans. The Merkids embodied a quiet truth. On the steppe, even modest groups shaped history through the ripples of their decisions. Between these tribes, alliances were rarely permanent. A shared enemy could bring rivals together, just as a sudden scarcity of pasture could drive allies apart. Leaders gathered in councils or exchanged gifts to secure cooperation, but always with an understanding that trust was provisional. The steppe taught caution. No tribe could afford complacency, and no success went uncontested for long. What seemed stable was often only a pause between changes. This dynamic world produced one calm discovery. Rivalry, rather than destroying the steppe, kept it flexible, preparing it for transformation. Military strength, though important, was not the only measure of power. Knowledge of grazing routes, seasonal movements, and diplomatic ties could influence outcomes just as strongly. A well-timed migration or a carefully negotiated marriage could shift the balance between tribes. Envoys traveled quietly across the plains, carrying words that could either soothe or unsettle. Rumors moved just as swiftly, shaping expectations and fears. In such an environment, success rested on perception as much as reality. The smallest decision could echo far beyond its origin. Despite these tensions, open conflict was not constant. Most tribes preferred to avoid prolonged warfare, which threatened their herds and vulnerable families. Battles were often short, shaped by mobility and surprise. Victory offered resources and prestige, but defeat could scatter a tribe across the grasslands, dissolving its identity. Even triumph came with risks, for dominance drew attention and resentment. The steppe, impartial and immense, rewarded balance more than conquest. Cultural similarities offered moments of connection. Though languages, customs, and beliefs varied, many tribes shared reverence for the sky, the land, and ancestral spirits. Rituals, songs, and festivals echoed familiar themes, reminding people that they were bound not only by rivalry, but by a common environment. These shared practices did not erase conflict, yet they created a subtle thread of unity, a quiet foundation that would one day support something larger. As seasons passed, the mosaic of tribes shifted once more. Alliances frayed, new leaders emerged, and rumors circulated of threats from beyond the steppe. No single tribe held unquestioned authority. There was strength everywhere, but unity nowhere. To an outside observer, this world might have seemed unstable, a landscape of ceaseless uncertainty. But within that uncertainty lay possibility. Rivalry kept the steppe alert, adaptable and open to change. It prepared hearts and minds for the idea that survival might one day require something greater than individual ambition. In this atmosphere of cautious competition, the tribes waited not knowingly but naturally for a different kind of leadership. Someone who could weave together the threads of rivalry, kinship, and shared heritage into a single fabric. The future remained unseen, but the conditions were quietly forming. The steppe had tested its peoples, hardened their skills, and sharpened their instincts. It had shown them that no tribe could endure alone forever. And so, beneath the endless sky, the Tatars, Karaits, Naimans, and Merkids continued their cycles of alliance and separation, unaware that their rivalries were shaping the very stage for a transformative moment in history. From this world of uncertainty, a child would rise. What strength grows in silence and scarcity? Long before the world knew the name Genghis Khan, a child was born beside the quiet waters of the Onon River. The year was around 1162, though precise dates dissolve in the haze of early memory. The land was open and wind-shaped, its rhythms guided not by walls or cities but by grass, sky, and the steady migrations of herds. His given name was Temujin, a name said to honor a captured enemy chieftain, though its deeper meaning remains softened by time. In that moment he was not a conqueror, not a leader, not a symbol. He was simply a newborn in a felt tent, surrounded by kin, held by a mother who could not yet imagine how far his footsteps would one day travel. Temujin's family belonged to the Borjigin lineage, a clan with respected ancestry but modest standing. His father, Yasuji, was a leader of a small band of followers, navigating the delicate world of tribal politics. His mother, Hoilan, had once been taken from her own people, the Okhanud, becoming wife and matriarch through the complex customs of the steppe. Their union, though shaped by turbulence, formed the foundation of a household that valued resilience, resourcefulness, and quiet endurance. In these early days, Temujin's world was intimate, defined less by the vastness of the steppe and more by the warmth of his family's campfire. Childhood on the steppe was shaped by movement. Seasons determined direction, and horses formed the heart of daily life. The young Temujin learned to watch the horizon, to listen for weather in the wind, and to sense the patterns of the grasslands. Even before he could ride, he absorbed the steady truth of nomadic existence. Survival depended on unity. Herds required care, families required cooperation, and scarcity demanded calm decisions. The steppe was not cruel, but it was uncompromising. It rewarded patience, skill, and the ability to adapt without complaint. A calm discovery emerges here. Before Temujin learned to command others, he learned to belong to kin, to rhythm, to land. His first lessons were not about power, but about connection. Yet this early stability did not last. When Temujin was still a boy, Yasuji died, likely poisoned by Tatars after sharing a meal during a journey. The news left the family unanchored. Without the protection of a strong male leader, their followers drifted away, unwilling to risk their own safety by staying loyal. Overnight, the household lost status, shelter, and security. Hoilan, now a widow, faced the vastness of the steppe with several young children and very little support. The departure of their allies was not marked by anger or confrontation, only the quiet, pragmatic reality that life on the steppe favored those with power. For Temujin, this was the first true experience of hardship. Hunger became familiar. There were days when roots, berries, and scraps were all the family could gather. The once protective world of kinship now felt exposed and fragile. Yet Hoilan held her children together with unwavering resolve. She taught them to forage, to sow, to hunt small game, and to rely on one another. Her presence offered a lesson that would echo throughout Temujin's life. Strength begins not with dominance, but with endurance. These years were shaped by silence. Long hours of gathering food, repairing clothing, and watching the herds from a distance. The family was isolated, but in that isolation, Temujin learned self-reliance. He understood that leadership was not guaranteed by birth, and safety was not inherited. Every improvement, every moment of relief had to be earned. This quiet struggle planted a seed of determination that would take many years to fully bloom. Among his siblings, tensions occasionally surfaced. Scarcity made even small disagreements feel heavy. Temujin's conflict with his half-brother Better, which would later lead to a tragic confrontation, began during this period of desperation. And yet, within these strained relationships, Temujin also learned the weight of responsibility. He was no longer a child protected by a household. He was a member of a fragile unit, needed for its survival. Despite difficulty, moments of closeness persisted. Hoyland's stories, shared under darkening skies, connected the children to ancestors and history. The flicker of lamplight on felt walls created a sense of continuity, a reminder that hardship was not an ending, but a chapter in a longer lineage. These evenings, calm and reflective, formed a quiet emotional anchor. They taught Temujin that identity was more than circumstance. It was a thread carried through generations. As he grew older, he spent increasing time outdoors, observing the behavior of animals, tracking paths across the hills, and learning to ride. The steppe became both teacher and test. Horses taught him balance and patience. The cold taught him resilience. The vast silence taught him contemplation. In these lessons, another calm discovery emerges. Scarcity sharpened awareness. It forged a mind attentive to detail, alert to change, and sensitive to opportunity. There were small signs of leadership even then. Temujin often took initiative, gathering firewood, organizing tasks, and supporting his siblings. His resolve was not loud or commanding, but steady. Within hardship, he found purpose. The world had taken much from him, yet it had given something unexpected. A sense of direction shaped not by privilege, but by necessity. Occasionally, distant riders would pass, reminding the family that a larger world still moved beyond their isolation. Clans formed alliances, disputes flared, and rivalries shifted. These glimpses of broader currents hinted at futures yet unseen. But for Temujin, the present was defined by a simpler truth: survival day by day, breath by breath. In this early chapter of his life, there was no prophecy, no sign that he would one day unite the steppe. What existed instead was a quiet resilience, a strength nurtured not by triumph, but by endurance. Scarcity did not harden him into bitterness. It clarified his understanding of vulnerability. The memory of hunger would later shape his compassion for loyalty and his intolerance for betrayal. The pain of abandonment would fuel his pursuit of unity. As adolescence approached, the weight of childhood hardship transformed into a quiet resolve. Temujin carried forward the lessons of his mother, the silence of lonely seasons, and the memory of early loss. These experiences formed the bedrock of his character, invisible to the world, yet unshakable. From hardship came resolve. How does loyalty become the first stone in a nation's foundation? As Temujin emerged from the shadows of childhood hardship, he stepped into a world where survival depended not only on skill, but on connection. The steppe could be harsh, but it also offered pathways, quiet opportunities to forge bonds that might steady an uncertain future. In these early years of adolescence and young adulthood, relationships became the quiet architecture of Temujin's destiny. Before armies, before titles, before empire, there were people. A friend, a bride, a handful of supporters who believed in a life larger than isolation. One of the earliest and most meaningful connections was with Jamuka. The two met in their youth and spent time together as sworn companions bound by mutual respect. Their friendship, marked by shared games, quiet conversations, and the innocent confidence of childhood, planted the idea that leadership could be shaped through companionship rather than force. Jamuka came from a more prestigious lineage, and his presence introduced Temujin to a wider network of possibilities. Though neither boy could foresee the path ahead, this bond offered Temujin a first glimpse of what trust beyond family might feel like. This friendship reflected a calm discovery. Alliances often begin not with strategy, but with shared moments of belonging. To Temujin, Jamuka represented a bridge between worlds, one foot in nobility, the other in the simple rhythms of youth. Together, they learned the subtle codes of respect that guided steppe society, the importance of gifts, gestures, and quiet promises. Even when their lives took separate paths, the memory of their early bond remained a gentle reminder that companionship could be both strength and solace. As Temujin approached adulthood, another relationship would shape his path in a deeper, more enduring way. According to custom, his father had once arranged a future marriage with the family of Day Sechin, a leader of the Angjarat tribe. The promise lingered even after Yasujiai's death, offering a thread of stability in an unpredictable world. And so, Temujin journeyed to the Angjarat camp, seeking not wealth or power, but the restoration of a connection that might anchor his future. There he met Borte. Their union began not as romance, but as alliance, two families linking their destinies through tradition. Yet over time, Borte became far more than a political partner. She offered steadiness, insight, and quiet confidence. Within the felt walls of their household, she created a space where Temujin could rest from struggle, think clearly, and feel understood. Borte's support was not loud or public. It was gentle, enduring, and steadfast. Through seasons of uncertainty, she remained a calm center in his life. Her dowry included a distinctive black sable cloak, a seemingly simple gift that would later become a symbol of Temujin's rising aspirations. In the steppe's culture of honor and exchange, objects carried meaning. The cloak represented goodwill, trust, and legitimacy, qualities Temujin would soon need. During these years, challenges still loomed. The Merkids, old rivals of Temujin's family, attacked and abducted Borte, disrupting the fragile peace of their new union. For Temujin, the loss was more than personal. It threatened the foundation of his emerging adulthood. Yet rather than retreat into despair, he reached outward, seeking support. He turned to allies who could help him reclaim what had been taken. One of the most significant among them was Togrul, later remembered as Ongkon, leader of the Karates. Years earlier, Yasujiai had aided Togrul, and Temujin now approached him with humility and respect, offering the sable cloak as a gift, a symbolic repayment of past loyalty. Togrul accepted, recognizing both the gesture and the young man's sincerity. This moment revealed a quiet truth of steppe politics. Relationships were a currency as precious as horses or land. With Togrul's support, and with Jamuka also lending assistance, Temujin gathered enough strength to confront the Merkids and rescue Borte. The victory was modest by future standards, but it marked a turning point. It showed that Temujin could inspire cooperation, draw allies together, and act decisively without cruelty or chaos. When Borte returned safely, their bond deepened into mutual respect, an alliance of both heart and purpose. This episode signaled the emergence of something new. Temujin was no longer merely a survivor. He was becoming a leader quietly, gradually, through relationships rather than conquest. In the years that followed, a small circle of followers began to gather around him. Some were relatives. Others were companions drawn by his calm resolve and sense of fairness. Among them were young men who would one day become central figures in the Mongol rise, brothers like Kasar and Belgudiai, and early supporters such as Borshu and Jelm. Their loyalty formed not through fear, but through gratitude. Temujin listened, shared burdens, and rewarded effort. For men accustomed to instability, his steadiness felt rare. These early companions learned together, herding, hunting, repairing saddles, and navigating the shifting politics of the steppe. Around campfires, they shared stories, hopes, and quiet fears. In these humble moments, a foundation formed, not of stone or wood, but of trust. Each follower represented more than manpower. They embodied belief in a future that none could fully imagine, but all could sense. Another calm discovery emerges. Leadership first grows in small circles, nurtured by loyalty rather than command. Temujin's household expanded slowly, shaped by shared work rather than grand ambition. Even as he gained supporters, he remained mindful of his past, of hunger, loss, and abandonment. This memory softened his approach. He offered opportunities to those of low status and welcomed individuals whom other leaders might overlook. In doing so, he fostered a community rooted not in lineage, but in merit and mutual reliance. Still, not all bonds remain simple. His relationship with Jamuka, once defined by childlike closeness, began to change. As both young men grew into adulthood, the contours of power came into sharper focus. Jamuka's noble birth pulled him toward a traditional path of aristocratic leadership, while Temujin's rise emerged from hardship and earned loyalty. Though they did not yet stand opposed, a subtle distance formed, a quiet divergence of destinies. Yet, in this moment, Temujin was not driven by rivalry. His attention rested on stability, protecting his family, honoring his supporters, and building a life grounded in dependable alliances. His focus was not on uniting tribes or leading armies. It was on ensuring that those who stood beside him would never face the abandonment he had once known. These early alliances formed a tapestry of connection, family, friendship, marriage, and loyalty that would one day stretch across continents. But for now, the story remained intimate and modest, shaped by shared meals, mended clothing, and long rides beneath a pale sky. The future empire existed only as an invisible outline, waiting quietly within the bonds being formed. Through Borte's partnership, Jamuka's companionship, Togrul's support, and the loyalty of early followers, Temujin began to see that strength could grow not from domination, but from unity. Trust became his first resource, and cooperation his first strategy. But unity was not yet complete. This section offers a quiet, measured retelling of one of history's great turning points, the gradual unification of the Mongol tribes under Temujin. Rather than focusing on violence or spectacle, it traces the slow weaving of alliances. Oaths exchanged on the open steppe, promises made beside riverbanks, and the calm persistence that turned scattered clans into a single people. Through negotiation, shared purpose, and careful leadership, Temujin transformed tribal rivalries into a collective identity. The battles become background. The emphasis rests on strategy, patience, and the subtle shift from individual survival to shared destiny. The narrative culminates in the year 1206, when Temujin is formally proclaimed Genghis Khan, not merely a name, but a title symbolizing unity, order, and a new horizon for the steppe. This section helps viewers feel the quiet magnitude of that moment. A world unchanged in its silence, yet forever altered in its direction. How does one voice become the gathering point of many? Perfect for viewers who find comfort in transformation. Those who enjoy watching a fragmented world slowly come together, step by steady step. This is a turning point story, but told gently, emphasizing calm evolution rather than chaos. On the Great Steppe, where horizons drift without walls and the wind knows no borders, there is a quiet question that lingers beneath history's surface. How does a nation of riders, forever moving, learn to stand together? For the Mongols, the answer did not begin with cities or monuments. It began with order. When Temujin emerged from the long struggle of unification, he faced a world still fragile in its new cohesion. The tribes had joined under one banner, but their loyalties were young, their memories of rivalry still close at hand. The victories, oaths, and alliances that had shaped his rise could not alone sustain a nation. The steppe had seen great leaders before, figures who united clans, only to watch them scatter once more. Temujin understood something deeper. Unity could not depend solely on personality. It needed principles, rules that would outlive a single voice, rules capable of binding thousands in shared purpose. And so, quietly, deliberately, the foundation of a new legal order took shape: the Yasa. The Yasa was not a law code carved in marble or copied onto scrolls. It was not recited in courts or displayed in city squares. Instead, it emerged as a living framework, spoken, memorized, carried on horseback across the plains. Its power was not in its permanence on paper, but in its presence within the minds of the people. It became the whispered reminder that even in a world of motion, there could be balance. At its heart, the Yasa was built on discipline. The steppe demanded it long before any law did. Survival itself was a lesson in precision. A horse poorly tended could mean death. A camp disorganized could invite disaster. The Yasa gathered these unspoken truths and translated them into rules that guided every rider. Theft was punished severely because property, horses, weapons, supplies was life. Military ranks were strictly observed, ensuring that even the youngest warrior understood his place within the greater whole. This discipline was not designed to suppress, but to protect. In the vast emptiness of the steppe, structure was a shield. Through clear expectations, the Mongols found calm. A world once fractured by clan feuds now shared a common rhythm. Yet the Yasa was more than order. It was a declaration of justice. Temujin had learned, through hardship, the sting of abandonment and the chaos of lawlessness. As a boy exiled with his family, he saw how easily the powerless could be cast aside. The Yasa answered that memory with a principle rare for its time: merit. Positions were granted not solely by birth, but by ability and loyalty. A herder could rise to command. A humble archer could become a general. This idea reshaped identity. The Mongols were no longer merely clans bound by blood. They were a nation bound by possibility. One of the most remarkable pillars of the Yasa was its religious openness. On the steppe, faith took many forms: shamanic traditions, Buddhism, Nestorian Christianity, Islam. Instead of choosing one, the Yasa protected them all. Temujin understood that diversity did not weaken unity. It strengthened it. By honoring the spiritual paths of his followers, he offered them dignity, and in return, received loyalty. In an age when persecution was common, this tolerance became a quiet revolution. It allowed the Mongol world to breathe, to welcome new peoples without demanding that they abandon their beliefs. The Yasa created space, a calm equilibrium in which difference could coexist with shared duty. Communication, too, became part of the law's fabric. Messengers were granted safe passage, for information was the lifeblood of an empire in motion. The relay stations, the swift horses, the disciplined couriers, all operated under the protection of the Yasa. Through them, the nation spoke to itself not in monuments but in movement. Law became not a boundary, but a bridge. Punishments under the Yasa could be severe, yet they served a purpose rooted in collective survival. Every rule reminded the people that they belonged to something larger than themselves. Even the prohibition against washing clothes in running water, sometimes cited in later accounts, reflected the delicate balance of life on the plains, where resources were precious. Each detail, whether grand or simple, reinforced the same message: the well-being of the whole depended on the discipline of the individual. As these rules settled into daily life, something subtle began to form: a shared identity. The Mongols did not define themselves through walls or borders, but through conduct. The Yasa shaped behavior, behavior shaped trust, and trust shaped the nation. In a world with no fixed capital, the law itself became the center. There was comfort in this. The riders who drifted across the grasslands knew that wherever they traveled, the same rules governed their world. Law became the quiet thread that stitched the horizon into a single fabric. It provided stability not through force, but through understanding. It made the unfamiliar feel familiar. And so, the Yasa was not merely legislation. It was a mindset, a way of living that transformed motion into unity. It taught that dignity could exist without permanence, that justice could flourish without stone courts, that a nation could be born without settling the earth beneath it. In the end, The true power of the Yasa was its promise, that even in a land where nothing stayed still, the people could remain connected. And through that connection, the Mongols found strength. Not loud, not violent, but steady. A nation, forged not from walls, but from rules that held them gently in place. Order invited new possibilities. What happens when ability outweighs ancestry? On the open steppe, where wind erased footprints and lineage once defined destiny, this question quietly reshaped an entire world. Before unification, Mongol society had long been guided by the weight of bloodlines. Power flowed through noble clans, and leadership was often inherited rather than earned. A person's place, warrior, herder, servant, seemed fixed by birth. The hierarchy was familiar, predictable, and rarely questioned. Yet beneath its surface lay a quiet truth. Talent was scattered everywhere, not only among the elite. Strength, insight, courage, these qualities were not confined to pedigrees. They appeared in ordinary riders, in young archers, in the overlooked and the unnamed. Temujin understood this deeply, shaped by his own early struggles outside privilege. He had seen how the powerful could ignore the capable simply because they lacked noble ancestry. And he felt, with unmistakable clarity, that a nation built solely on heritage stood on fragile ground. To endure, leadership had to be earned, proven in action, not inherited through memory. So a subtle revolution began. The new Mongol order under Genghis Khan opened its doors to merit. Rank and responsibility were granted not by birthright, but by ability and loyalty. A skilled rider could become a commander. A brilliant strategist, even from humble origins, could counsel the Khan. The battlefield, the council tent, the caravan trail, these became arenas where talent could rise. This shift was not loud or ceremonious. It unfolded quietly, through countless decisions. When a common herdsman demonstrated unwavering discipline, he was elevated. When a young soldier showed remarkable composure under pressure, he was trusted with greater responsibility. Each promotion, each acknowledgement of skill, sent the same message across the steppe. Your future is not confined by your past. For many, this brought comfort. It offered possibility where there had once been limitation. The Mongol world, once rigid in its social expectations, became fluid. Mobility was no longer merely physical. It became social, allowing individuals to move upward through the ranks, shaping their own destinies through talent and dedication. This transformation touched every corner of society. The army, especially, reflected it with clarity. Units were reorganized into a decimal system, tens, hundreds, thousands, each led by officers chosen for competence rather than pedigree. This structure ensured that even the smallest group had a leader capable of decision, discipline, and care. Merit became the quiet engine that powered the military. Success on the field was not luck or lineage. It was skill distributed wisely. Trust flowed upward as well as downward. When leaders were selected for their proven abilities, the riders beneath them felt secure. They knew their commanders understood hardship, precision, and risk. The bond between leader and follower became personal, not ceremonial. It was forged through shared experience, the cold of winter marches, the hunger of long campaigns, the trials of survival. In this shared reality, loyalty deepened. Even beyond the battlefield, merit reshaped the everyday rhythms of Mongol life. Administrators, envoys, and craftsmen rose through skill. Artisans found new respect. Interpreters, scribes, and advisors, individuals who might once have remained invisible, now influenced decisions at the highest levels. The empire began to breathe with new energy, fueled by a wider spectrum of voices and talents. This openness extended across tribes and backgrounds. Former rivals, once separated by hostility, could now join the Mongol order and find genuine opportunity. The system quietly encouraged inclusion. A captured warrior could become a trusted ally. A foreign artisan could become essential to the state. The boundaries that once divided the steppe softened, replaced by a broader identity: service to the nation. Mobility also strengthened unity. When advancement was accessible, resentment faded. Ambition became constructive rather than rebellious. Instead of competing through clan rivalry, individuals competed through excellence. The result was stability, a calm cohesion born not from force, but from fairness. And yet, this transformation was not simply practical. It carried an emotional weight. For the poor, the orphaned, the overlooked, merit offered dignity. It told them that their lives mattered, that their efforts could shape the future of the nation. In a society once ruled by ancestral privilege, this was profoundly healing. It turned personal resilience into collective strength. At the same time, the noble families who had long held power faced a new reality. Their inherited status no longer guaranteed leadership. Some resisted, clinging to tradition. Others adapted, proving their worth through action rather than lineage. In this quiet negotiation between old and new, the Mongol identity evolved. Prestige no longer stemmed from ancestry alone, but from the ability to contribute meaningfully to the whole. This merit-based world also changed how the Mongols saw themselves. They were no longer merely members of clans. They were participants in a shared enterprise. Their success was tied to the success of the nation. Ambition became aligned with purpose. The horizon widened, not just physically, but socially. Through these changes, the empire gained something rare: flexibility. While other realms were bound by rigid hierarchies, the Mongols could adapt. They could absorb new peoples, learn new skills, and elevate new leaders. Merit gave them resilience, allowing their society to bend without breaking. In this way, a vast social transformation occurred, not through conquest but through opportunity. It was not announced in proclamations or carved into stone. It unfolded quietly, in the choices made each day. It lived in the belief that talent, wherever found, deserved recognition. And so, the Mongol Empire grew not only in size but in spirit. It became a place where possibility traveled as freely as its riders, where skill could lift a life, and where destiny rested in the hands of the capable. A structured nation could now look outward. How can simplicity become the engine of global power? On the steppe, where the land stretched unbroken beneath a quiet sky, the answer took the shape of hooves, wool, and patient movement. A logistical world both modest and extraordinary. Before empires, before campaigns across continents, the Mongols were herders. Their lives turned gently around animals: horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and the sturdy Bactrian camel. Each species offered something essential: meat, milk, wool, transport, warmth. Together, these herds formed a living storehouse, moving wherever grass and water led. In a land without cities or granaries, this mobility was survival. Later, it would become strength. Among all these animals, the horse stood at the center. Small, resilient, and tireless, the Mongol horse could endure harsh winters, long distances, and sparse grazing. Riders did not stable them or pamper them. The horses lived much as their ancestors had, roaming in vast herds. A single warrior might possess several mounts, switching between them to preserve stamina. This simple practice, rotating horses rather than exhausting one, allowed the Mongols to travel astonishing distances without pause. Movement became continuous, fluid, almost effortless. Here lay a calm discovery. Speed was not created through urgency, but through preservation. By caring for their animals with quiet foresight, the Mongols extended their reach farther than settled armies ever imagined. Horses also provided nourishment. Fermented mare's milk, dried curds, and meat from occasional slaughter sustained riders during long journeys. Food was not stored in heavy carts or guarded depots. It traveled with the army, grazing as it moved. This living supply chain required no roads, no wagons, and no elaborate planning. The land itself, with its grasslands and open horizons, became the granary. Simplicity became efficiency. Other animals played crucial roles as well. Sheep and goats offered constant milk and wool, creating clothing and shelter against the cold. Camels carried heavy loads across arid terrain, enabling the transport of tents, tools, and trade goods. Oxen pulled carts when families migrated. Each creature contributed quietly, forming a network of resources that traveled wherever the people did. The Mongols did not depend on fixed infrastructure. Their infrastructure breathed. This mobility shaped their armies. While many civilizations labored under the weight of supply trains, the Mongols moved lightly. Warriors packed dried meat, cheese, and leather bags of fermented milk, requiring little replenishment. They could cross deserts and frozen plains without waiting for provisions to arrive. Their camps rose and vanished like passing clouds, leaving no need for permanent bases. The result was strategic freedom, the ability to strike unexpectedly, retreat calmly, or reposition without strain. Even communication followed this pattern of elegant simplicity. The Ortu relay system, a network of way stations spaced across vast distances, enabled messengers to change horses and continue swiftly. Though modest in construction, often little more than tents or huts, these stations formed a web across Asia. Messages that might have taken months in other regions could travel in days. Orders, intelligence, and reports moved with steady rhythm, allowing commanders to coordinate campaigns over unimaginable distances. Another quiet discovery emerges here. Information, when allowed to flow freely, becomes its own form of power. The Mongols did not rely solely on strength of arms, but on the smooth circulation of knowledge. Their logistics were also deeply attuned to nature. Movement followed the seasons, to higher pastures in summer, to sheltered valleys in winter. The cycle of grass determined routes, teaching patience and planning. This understanding of landscape became strategic insight. Commanders knew where water lay hidden, where herds could rest, where snow might hinder movement. Geography was not an obstacle but a companion, guiding decisions with calm certainty. Yet this system depended on discipline. Each rider took responsibility for his mounts, equipment, and rations. Carelessness could mean exhaustion or starvation. In this way, logistical success was not imposed from above. It lived within each individual, a culture of preparedness shaped over generations. Moreover, the Mongols used their mobility not only for war but for trade. Caravans crossed Asia, carrying furs, textiles, metalwork, and salt. These journeys strengthened routes that would later serve military needs. The economy, too, was mobile, another layer of support that expanded naturally with the people's movement. Compared to the stone-built storehouses of settled civilizations, the Mongol system seemed minimal. There were no towering granaries, no bustling ports, no vast road networks. And yet, its very lightness gave it advantage. Where others faltered under distance, cost, and rigidity, the Mongols advanced. Their power was not stored in structures but sustained by living cycles, grazing, migration, and renewal. In this, their logistics mirrored their worldview, resilient, adaptable, unbound. Strength was not a fixed monument but a motion sustained over time. As the empire began to turn outward, this nomadic engine proved decisive. Preparations for campaigns required no massive buildup. Horses multiplied naturally. Food replenished itself across the steppe. Communication already stretched across long distances. The Mongols were ready not because they gathered resources in one place, but because they carried their resources within their way of life. And so, a quiet truth emerged. The steppe itself had trained them for empire. Every journey of herds, every rotation of mounts, every seasonal migration. These were lessons in endurance, coordination, and foresight. When expansion began, they did not need to reinvent their systems. They simply extended them. What seemed simple was, in its own way, profound. Their logistics were not the product of grand design, but of lived experience, a harmony between people, animals, and land. Through this balance, the Mongols achieved something rare: mobility without fragility, speed without haste, power without excess. The world beyond the steppe awaited. What unfolds when curiosity meets caution across unfamiliar borders? The answer begins not with battle, but with a quiet exchange of goods, ideas, and intentions, two worlds approaching each other across the breadth of Central Asia. By the early 13th century, the Mongol realm had expanded beyond the familiar horizons of the steppe. Under Genghis Khan, unity and structure had taken root, giving the nation the confidence to look outward. To the west lay the Khwarazmian Empire, a settled urban civilization stretching from Persia to the Sir marked by cities of stone, bustling markets, and a network of trade that linked Islamic, Turkic, and Persian cultures. It was a world shaped by merchants, scholars, and kings, so different from the nomadic rhythms of the Mongol plains. Yet, despite their contrasts, both worlds shared a quiet interest: commerce. The Silk Road, that ancient artery of exchange, offered a bridge between them. Genghis Khan, seeking stability and prosperity for his people, understood that trade could enrich not just the Mongols, but all who participated. And so, rather than sending scouts or soldiers, he sent merchants, caravans bearing goods, and a gesture of peaceful intent. This approach reflected a calm discovery. Before empires confront each other through force, they often meet through curiosity. Silk, leather, furs, and precious metals traveled westward, while fabrics, spices, and crafted goods flowed east. The Mongols, long accustomed to a life of movement and resourcefulness, saw in these exchanges a glimpse of a broader world, one filled with cities, written administration, and established diplomacy. But beneath this surface of opportunity lay uncertainty. The Khwarazmian ruler, Shah Muhammad II, governed a realm proud of its sophistication. From his perspective, the Mongols appeared unfamiliar, a rising power on the periphery, their strength not yet fully understood, their intentions still ambiguous. Where the Mongols saw partnership, the Shah saw caution. Even so, the first gestures were gentle. Genghis Khan sent letters expressing goodwill, recognizing the Shah as a powerful ruler, and suggesting open trade. Such diplomacy showed a willingness to coexist, grounded in the Khan's practical desire for economic stability. The Mongols, though formidable in war, valued peace when it brought mutual advantage. The turning point came quietly, not on a battlefield, but in the border town of Otrar. A caravan of Mongol merchants, traveling under the assurance of peace, arrived seeking to exchange goods. Suspicion intervened. The local governor, perhaps fearful of espionage or enticed by opportunity, arrested the merchants, confiscated their goods, and, in time, ordered their execution. In that moment, trust faltered. News traveled back across the steppe, carried through the relay of messengers and the whisper of distant reports. For Genghis Khan, the loss was not merely commercial. It was a breach of diplomacy, a violation of hospitality and exchange. Yet even then, his response was measured. He did not rush toward retaliation. Instead, he sent an embassy to the Shah, asking for justice and the punishment of the governor responsible. This gesture reflected a belief that conflict need not be inevitable, that a wrong could be addressed through dialogue. The Shah, however, chose a different path. Distrustful and perhaps eager to assert power, he ordered the lead envoy executed and the others humiliated. The door to peaceful resolution quietly closed. Here, another calm realization emerges. The course of history can shift not through grand events, but through the refusal to listen. With diplomacy exhausted, Genghis Khan prepared for a response, not in anger, but in deliberate strategy. He gathered intelligence, studied the geography of Khwarazm, and organized his forces with precision. The Mongols did not rush. They observed, planned, and moved with the patience that had long characterized their way of life. To many observers, the contrast between the two worlds was striking. The Khwarazmian Empire relied on fortified cities, dense populations, and a proud military tradition rooted in settled power. The Mongols relied on mobility, coordination, and the quiet confidence of riders who had mastered the vastness of open land. One world stood behind walls. The other drew strength from motion. When the campaign began, it unfolded with calm inevitability. Mongol forces moved like flowing water, bypassing defenses, dividing into coordinated units, and striking in patterns shaped by observation rather than haste. Cities that had believed themselves secure found their supply lines interrupted, their movements anticipated, their defenders outmaneuvered. The Mongols used intelligence and mobility to shape the battlefield long before engaging in direct conflict. What emerged was not simply conquest, but adaptation. The Mongols learned siegecraft from captured engineers, applied foreign techniques, and integrated new knowledge into their existing strengths. Their approach reflected another subtle truth. Power grows when it remains open to learning. For the people within the Khwarazmian realm, the campaign was bewildering. Armies that once seemed invincible discovered that distance offered no protection, and terrain offered no refuge. The Mongols, sustained by their logistical simplicity, moved with a steadiness that eroded resistance. One city after another fell, not through overwhelming force alone, but through coordinated strategy, psychological insight, and unwavering communication. Shah Muhammad, faced with mounting losses, struggled to regain control. Rather than unifying his forces, he retreated, moving from city to city in search of safety. The empire, so vast and intricate, began to fracture under pressure. The Mongols, meanwhile, continued calmly, methodically, without the urgency of desperation. Their campaign was not fueled by fury, but by a sense of purpose shaped by earlier betrayals and broken trust. As Khwarazm crumbled, the Mongols gained more than territory. They gained knowledge of foreign cultures, urban administration, and new landscapes. The campaign opened pathways that would later lead into Persia, the Caucasus, and beyond. What began as a response to a diplomatic breach became a turning point in Mongol expansion, revealing a world far larger than the steppe. And through it all, a quiet lesson lingered. Even the greatest distances can be crossed when guided by patience, clarity, and resolve. By the end of the campaign, the Mongols stood at the edge of new possibilities. Victory had not only secured their western frontier but had shown that their system, mobile, adaptable, and united, could operate far beyond its birthplace. Success opened new horizons. How does a mobile people learn to overcome walls? On the edge of the Mongol world, this question rose like a quiet challenge, a barrier of stone and culture waiting to be understood. When the Mongols first looked south toward the lands ruled by the Jin Dynasty, they saw a world unlike their own. Northern China was shaped not by open grasslands, but by cities, fortresses, and fields bound to the rhythms of agriculture. Its landscape held walls, granaries, watchtowers, and rivers threaded with canals. Its people lived in settled communities, governed by long-standing bureaucratic systems, and supported by an economy far more complex than the pastoral life of the steppe. To the nomadic Mongols, this terrain seemed almost foreign. It was a place shaped by permanence, stone foundations, administrative registers, and defensive networks that stretched across entire provinces. The Jin Dynasty, rooted in Jurchen leadership and enriched by Chinese traditions, commanded vast resources and a formidable military infrastructure. For centuries, they had held dominion over northern China, defending their borders through fortifications and disciplined armies. Yet between these two worlds lay a gradual shift, a growing awareness that their destinies were becoming intertwined. The Mongols' initial encounters with the Jin were cautious and exploratory. Rather than rushing toward confrontation, Genghis Khan gathered information, studying the political landscape and the defenses that guarded it. He understood that a successful campaign would require more than courage. It would require knowledge of terrain, weather, and the structure of fortified resistance. The Jin Empire, confident behind its walls and battlements, underestimated this quiet preparation. They viewed the Mongols through the lens of old assumptions, as steppe riders skilled in open battle but unprepared for siege warfare. The walls, they believed, would hold. But the Mongols were listening, learning, and adapting. In the early campaigns, they relied on familiar strengths, mobility, coordination, and the disciplined movement of cavalry. They skirted fortresses rather than storming them, cutting supply routes, isolating cities, and striking smaller targets to weaken the system from its edges. Their strategy was not driven by brute force, but by patient disruption. Each maneuver revealed more about the Jin defenses: how garrisons rotated, how signals traveled, how grain moved along rivers to feed the cities. A calm discovery began to take shape. Not all walls are broken through, some are outlasted. As the campaigns widened, the Mongols sought expertise beyond their own traditions. From conquered peoples and hired specialists, they learned the techniques of siegecraft: building rams, constructing catapults, digging trenches, and controlling riverways. Chinese, Khitan, and Jurchen engineers became part of Mongol forces, bringing knowledge of machines and fortifications. The Mongol army, once defined by its cavalry, slowly expanded its skill set. Learning became a form of strength. One of the most significant aspects of this adaptation was the use of foreign technologies. Trebuchets and counterweight engines, unfamiliar to steppe warfare, were soon incorporated into Mongol strategy. These additions allowed the army to strike at city walls from a distance, changing the balance of power. Instead of being held at bay, the Mongols could now apply pressure directly to the defenses that had once seemed unassailable. Another transformation emerged in their use of spies, scouts, and defectors. Information flowed steadily into Mongol command, revealing not only military details but cultural and administrative patterns. They learned how tax systems operated, how officials communicated, and how civilians responded to crisis. Understanding society became as important as understanding terrain. And through this accumulation of insight, a subtle realization formed: victory was not simply the conquest of cities. It was the mastery of unfamiliar knowledge. The Mongols also adapted their timing. Rather than launching assaults in seasons of abundance, they chose winter campaigns. Frozen rivers became natural roads, enabling movement across otherwise impassable barriers. Armies traveled swiftly over ice, bypassing choke points and surprising defenders who assumed winter would bring stillness. The cold, which might have immobilized other forces, became an ally, a quiet companion that expanded Mongol mobility. Northern China was also a lesson in endurance. Cities could hold out for months or years, relying on stored grain and reinforced walls. The Mongols countered this by encircling strongholds, cutting access to farmland, and waiting with calm patience. Hunger, disease, and uncertainty became as powerful as weapons. The Mongols did not need to rush. Their supplies traveled with them, sustained by herds and careful planning. This interplay between mobility and siegecraft reflected a deeper shift. The Mongols were no longer merely a nomadic confederation. They were becoming an imperial force, capable of operating across multiple environments, adapting to challenges rather than avoiding them. Inside the Jin Empire, pressure began to mount. Political divisions, economic strain, and the psychological weight of an enemy that moved with such quiet confidence weakened the dynasty's cohesion. Some officials advocated resistance, others negotiation. Regions fluctuated between loyalty and surrender, unsure of the future. Walls that once symbolized security now felt like boundaries that trapped rather than protected. In this atmosphere, the Mongols advanced steadily. City after city, region after region, fell or capitulated. Some were taken through force, others through agreements that offered leniency in exchange for cooperation. In many cases, the Mongols spared those who submitted peacefully, allowing administration to continue under their oversight. This policy encouraged surrender and reduced prolonged conflict, another form of adaptation shaped by practicality rather than cruelty. And as northern China gradually shifted under Mongol influence, a quiet transformation took place within the empire itself. The Mongols began to govern settled populations, collect taxes, and manage agricultural production, tasks far removed from the rhythms of pastoral life. This experience prepared them for future rule, laying the groundwork for a more complex imperial identity. By the time the Jin Dynasty's power fragmented, the Mongols had gained far more than territory. They had acquired knowledge of urban administration, engineering, and diplomacy. They had learned to command infantry alongside cavalry, to build as well as to ride, and to shape strategy not just around movement but around endurance. Their victory was not sudden or explosive. It unfolded through years of observation, adjustment, and quiet determination. In learning how to overcome walls, they learned how to expand themselves, becoming something larger, more adaptable, and more capable than before. Experience bred innovation. How does learning quietly reshape destiny? When the Mongol armies first looked upon the walled cities of Central Asia and northern China, they were not met with open fields or galloping horizons, but with stone, towers, battlements, and gates sealed shut. For a people shaped by movement, these walls seemed like a different kind of enemy, unyielding, silent, and patient. In this calm confrontation, something subtle began to unfold. The Mongols, who had mastered the windswept steppe, found themselves studying the stillness of masonry and the problem of how to bridge distance without a horse beneath them. At the beginning, siegecraft was not their strength. Their power had always come from mobility, arrows, speed, and the ability to disappear and reappear like a shifting horizon. But the cities of the Jin Dynasty and the Khwarazmian realm offered a new reality. These places held grain reserves, workshops, trade hubs, and wealth that could not be claimed in a single charge. They required patience, observation, and new forms of knowledge. And rather than recoil from the unfamiliar, the Mongols did something surprisingly quiet. They watched, they listened, and they learned. This learning began with people. Engineers, artisans, siege masters, and defectors from conquered regions were not simply taken as prisoners. They were welcomed as teachers. Chinese engineers knew the mechanics of traction trebuchets and counterweight catapults. Khwarazmian craftsmen understood how to dig mines beneath walls and collapse foundations. Muslim specialists from Transoxiana knew the chemistry of early incendiaries and the principles of water management. Each carried a fragment of wisdom, and in the Mongol camp, these fragments were woven into a single, evolving art. What made this process remarkable was its lack of arrogance. The Mongols did not assume superiority. They were simply open. If an idea worked, it was adopted. If it failed, it was abandoned without pride. This quiet pragmatism became their greatest tool. Soon, their armies traveled with teams of engineers, carpenters, sappers, and logisticians, moving workshops capable of producing siege towers, rams, and catapults from local materials. Even forests became resources. Trees felled and shaped into beams could be transformed into towering machines within days. What once seemed impossible began to feel methodical. One of the most transformative innovations was the counterweight trebuchet, learned in part from Chinese and later Persian engineers. Unlike simpler traction devices, these machines could hurl stones across great distances with steady, rhythmic force. In the calm arc of these stones, walls cracked, towers shook, and the balance of power shifted. Yet beyond the noise, there was something strategic taking shape. The Mongols had learned to extend their reach without riding forward. Power no longer depended solely on the horse. Another quiet breakthrough lay beneath the earth. Sappers began to dig tunnels under walls, weakening their foundations. These tunnels were propped with wooden supports, which could be burned at the right moment, causing a sudden collapse. It was a slow, hidden effort, almost invisible but devastating when revealed. This method required patience, coordination, and close communication between commanders and engineers. It demonstrated that Mongol warfare was no longer about speed alone. It now embraced time as a tool. Psychological strategy also evolved. The Mongols began to offer cities a choice: peaceful surrender in exchange for safety, or resistance followed by siege. This calm ultimatum was not emotional but calculated. Many garrisons surrendered to avoid destruction, recognizing the Mongols' growing capability. Information spread across regions, stories of efficient campaigns, negotiated truces, and the consistent fulfillment of terms. The Mongols did not rely on fear alone. They relied on reputation, predictability, and the logic of self-preservation. Siegecraft, in this sense, became as much about persuasion as engineering. Another innovation emerged through communication. The Mongols learned how to coordinate large sieges with multiple fronts, using signal flags, drums, and mounted messengers to direct attacks with precision. Even during prolonged sieges, mobility remained embedded within their methods. Cavalry screened the countryside, preventing reinforcements and cutting supply routes. While engineers worked at the walls, horsemen ensured no relief could arrive. Siege and steppe warfare melded into a single, balanced strategy. At times, adaptation meant embracing foreign ideas entirely. When facing fortified cities along rivers or coastal regions, the Mongols adopted naval technology, commandeering ships, learning riverine tactics, and even constructing fleets with the help of Chinese shipwrights. The sea, once distant from the steppe imagination, became another surface on which Mongol strategy could glide. The empire's learning had moved from land to water, from walls to waves. Through all of this, a quiet pattern emerged. The Mongols rarely repeated mistakes. Each fortress, each city, each campaign became a lesson. Engineers documented what worked. Commanders revised their plans. Artisans refined their designs. The army became not just a fighting force but a traveling school of experimentation. Warfare transformed into a cycle of observation, adaptation, and application. The Mongols were never static, even when their armies stood still outside a city's gates. This adaptability had profound consequences. It allowed them to conquer regions that once seemed unreachable. It enabled the siege of Zhongdu, the breach of Samarkand, and the steady fall of cities that believed their walls were eternal. But beyond conquest, it reshaped identity. The Mongol Empire was no longer defined only by open grasslands. It now threaded itself through urban centers, waterways, and fortified landscapes. The steppe mindset had expanded, absorbing the complexities of the wider world. Amid these transformations, a quiet truth emerged. Learning, not force alone, propelled the empire forward. The Mongols did not cling to the old ways out of nostalgia. Instead, they trusted curiosity. They believed that strength could be found in unfamiliar knowledge, that a borrowed idea could become a cornerstone of destiny. In this, they left behind a legacy deeper than the roar of battle, a legacy of adaptation. As the early campaigns concluded, the Mongol armies stood different than when they began. They were still swift, still disciplined, still tied to the rhythm of horses and horizons. But now they carried with them the memory of walls shattered, tunnels dug, machines assembled, and ideas transformed. The steppe had met the city, and from that meeting, a new kind of power emerged, quiet, cumulative, and enduring. How does an empire learn to move without its founder? When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the empire he left behind was vast, powerful, and full of motion. Yet his passing introduced a rare stillness, a moment when the future seemed to balance gently between uncertainty and possibility. The Mongol world had been shaped so deeply by one man's vision that the question of what came next felt almost like listening for an echo. In that quiet, a new leader stepped forward, Ogdi, the third son, chosen not for passion or ambition, but for steadiness. Ogdi's rule began not with a dramatic shift, but with calm continuity. His first act was to honor the decisions made at the Kurultai, affirming unity rather than asserting dominance. He understood something subtle yet vital. The empire did not need a replacement for Genghis. It needed someone who could help it breathe, settle, and continue. His leadership was less about forging a new identity and more about allowing the existing one to mature. One of Ogdi's earliest priorities was structure. The Mongols had conquered enormous lands, but lands alone did not make an empire. Administration did. He confirmed the creation of postal relay stations, yam routes, across Asia, ensuring faster communication than most settled states had ever imagined. These stations, spaced across vast distances, became the quiet arteries of governance, allowing orders, reports, and messages to move with remarkable clarity. In a world once defined by speed of hoof, Ogdi refined that speed into organization. With stability taking shape, attention turned westward. The lands beyond Central Asia, toward the Rus principalities and further into Europe, were unfamiliar and distant, yet they beckoned with strategic opportunity. Under Genghis, Mongol armies had scouted these frontiers. Under Ogdi, they would commit to them. But unlike the personal campaigns of his father, Ogdi's expansion was guided by delegation. He appointed trusted generals, most notably Subutai, to lead large-scale operations. It was a quiet but meaningful shift. The empire was learning to move through shared command rather than singular direction. The Western campaigns began with measured steps. Against the Volga Bulgars, the Mongols tested routes, climate, and supply lines. They learned to navigate river systems, forests, and unfamiliar winters. Their success was not instantaneous. Instead, it unfolded through patience. Each engagement taught them something about terrain, fortification, or communication. The Mongols were no longer simply expanding, they were refining their ability to expand. By 1237, a coordinated campaign into the Rus principalities began. Cities like Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev fell in stages, not through reckless charge but through methodical siegecraft and controlled movement, echoes of the lessons learned in China and Central Asia. Cavalry screened the countryside while engineers worked steadily at city walls. Behind every conquest was a rhythm. Observe, adapt, advance. Even in distant landscapes, the Mongols carried with them not just force but memory, an understanding of how to blend old strengths with new terrain. As victories accumulated, a new horizon appeared, Europe itself. By 1241, Mongol forces entered Hungary and Poland. Battles at Legnica and Mohi demonstrated the precision and flexibility of Mongol tactics. Yet even at the height of momentum, the expansion remained tied to deeper considerations. Reports and decisions flowed back to Ogdi through the Yam network. The empire was no longer dependent on a ruler standing at the front line. It was learning to function as a coordinated whole. During this same period, Ogdi nurtured something less visible but equally transformative: a capital. On the Orkhon River, he founded Karakorum, a city of workshops, palaces, diplomats, and artisans drawn from every corner of the empire. It was not a grand spectacle by the standards of older civilizations, but its meaning was profound. For a nomadic people, a capital was a statement of maturity. It gave the empire a center of gravity, a place where decisions could settle and where ideas could converge. Carved from the steppe, Karakorum symbolized a gentle shift from movement alone to balance between motion and permanence. Ogdi also continued the policy of religious openness established by his father. Clerics, monks, imams, and shamans all found space at his court. Diversity was not treated as a threat but as a resource. This atmosphere helped weave together the many cultures now under Mongol rule, creating trust that military conquest alone could never secure. In this calm inclusivity, the empire's identity widened. Yet the Western expansions were not without cost. Distance stretched supply lines. Climate tested endurance. And as the empire grew, so did the quiet pressures of coordination between distant khanates and commanders. Ogdi, though steady, was not eternal. In 1241, news of his death reached the advancing armies. Mongol tradition required generals to return for a new Kurultai, and so the armies withdrew from Europe. The withdrawal was neither defeat nor retreat, but a reminder: leadership remained the axis on which the empire turned. Looking back, Ogdi's reign was not defined by spectacle or singular triumph. It was defined by continuation. He preserved momentum without haste, expanded territory without losing cohesion, and gave the empire administrative depth it had never known. Under his guidance, the Mongols proved they could move without their founder, not in chaos, but in calm direction. New paths led farther west. What whispers travel ahead of an empire's footsteps? By the early 1240s, the Mongol Empire, guided by Ogdi Khan's steady hand and the strategic genius of generals like Subutai and Batu, had extended its influence across Central Asia and into the forests and plains of Eastern Europe. From the steppe to the Carpathians, the empire moved with precision, its approach quiet yet undeniable. leaving an imprint not through noise but through careful observation and calculated action. The lands of Hungary, Poland, and the Rus principalities had never before witnessed such distant power, and the first murmurs of their arrival traveled ahead like ripples across a still lake. The initial campaigns were deliberate. The Mongols approached Eastern Europe in multiple columns, each tracing a path guided by intelligence, weather, and terrain. Forests, rivers, and marshes, often considered obstacles by settled armies, became tools of strategy. Units screened one another, preventing reinforcements and gathering information about city defenses. Mobility, honed over decades on the steppe, allowed the army to appear where it was least expected, creating the subtle impression of inevitability rather than chaos. For many European towns and principalities, the Mongols arrived almost like a distant echo at first. Travelers, traders, and refugees brought stories of fast-moving riders who struck quickly, circumventing fortifications, and disappearing before a counterattack could be mounted. These whispers spread ahead of the main army, shaping perception and morale. The psychological dimension of the Mongol advance was subtle yet powerful. By the time a force appeared in full view, fear and uncertainty had already softened resistance. Knowledge, more than force, was often the first instrument of conquest. One of the first major engagements occurred in Poland at the Battle of Legnica in 1241. The Mongols, operating with careful coordination, drew the European knights into positions where mobility and archery proved decisive. Cavalry feigned retreats, enticing heavy armored forces into disadvantageous terrain. Precision and timing, hallmarks of Mongol strategy, allowed smaller forces to achieve disproportionate results. In contrast to the dramatic portrayals of conflict in later history, these victories were the result of observation, patience, and methodical planning rather than sudden, chaotic fury. In Hungary, the Battle of Mohi further demonstrated the empire's quiet mastery of logistics and coordination. The Mongols approached the Sajo River with a combination of bridges, diversions, and controlled feints. By integrating siege techniques, cavalry mobility, and knowledge of local geography, they neutralized fortified positions with minimal wasted effort. Cities surrendered not only from the threat of immediate destruction but from the careful demonstration of strategic inevitability. Resistance, where it arose, was overcome through coordinated pressure and careful planning rather than reckless violence. Beyond the battlefield, the Mongols observed the social and political structures of Europe with calm attentiveness. Castles, guilds, and civic councils presented new forms of administration. Trade networks, market towns, and river systems offered both opportunity and challenge for occupation and movement. Mongol commanders took note of these structures, adapting their strategies to local realities. They understood that conquest in Europe would require not only force but a nuanced approach to governance and intelligence. These campaigns also left a quiet impression on the European consciousness. Reports of Mongol mobility, discipline, and tactical innovation traveled back through merchant networks and diplomatic channels. Though many details were misunderstood or embellished over time, the underlying reality of a distant, highly coordinated force reshaped local perceptions of what lay beyond the known world. European leaders, accustomed to feudal rivalries and localized warfare, began to recognize a wider stage of geopolitical dynamics, one in which speed, communication, and adaptation held as much power as armies and fortresses. Interestingly, the Mongols themselves encountered limits. The vast distances, winter conditions, and unfamiliar terrain required careful pacing. Supply lines had to be maintained through portable resources, herds, and local acquisition. Generals exercised restraint when necessary, withdrawing to consolidate gains rather than risking overextension. In this, the campaigns were not impulsive raids but calculated explorations, extensions of the same philosophy that had guided campaigns in Asia: observation, adaptation, and movement. A subtle insight emerges. The Mongols' presence in Europe reshaped the continent not merely through conquest, but by revealing the existence of a highly organized, adaptive society beyond the horizon. The campaigns served as a quiet lesson in scale, discipline, and strategic patience. They demonstrated that empire could operate far from its heartland, sustained by logistics, communication, and flexible command. By the spring of 1242, the Mongol forces had reached the furthest edges of Europe's central plains. Although the death of Ogdi Khan soon required withdrawal, the campaign had achieved its objectives. Cities were subdued, routes were mapped, and knowledge of European military and administrative systems had been gained. The army returned east, carrying both conquest and insight. The Mongols had touched Europe, leaving whispers of their arrival that would echo for decades in chronicles, folklore, and the collective memory of the lands they had traversed. But expansion brought new complexity. How does a vast realm remain connected? By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched across mountains, deserts, rivers, and plains, territories once thought impossible to unite under a single authority. The challenge was no longer only military, it was organizational. Conquest had created space, but space alone does not constitute empire. To hold it, the Mongols developed a system of governance that was both subtle and resilient, allowing distant regions to remain integrated while respecting the diverse peoples within them. At the heart of this administration was the principle of delegation. Ogdi and his successors understood that no central figure could oversee every city, fortress, or caravan. Trusted generals, family members, and appointed governors acted as intermediaries, carrying authority and decisions across thousands of miles. Each official had clearly defined responsibilities, creating layers of shared power. This distributed governance ensured that the empire could operate even when the central leadership was distant, maintaining cohesion without over-reliance on a single person. Communication was the vital connective tissue. The YAM, or relay station network, stretched across the empire like quiet veins of information. At these stations, mounted couriers could change horses, rest briefly, and continue without delay. Messages, intelligence reports, and official decrees traveled faster than most armies could move, allowing commanders to coordinate operations across continents. Merchants and envoys also relied on these routes, further reinforcing the bonds between the steppe and settled regions. In this way, mobility, long the source of military strength, was transformed into the backbone of governance. Another layer of organization came through census and record-keeping. The Mongols recognized that understanding populations, resources, and geography was essential for effective administration. Tribes were counted, households registered, and productive capacity noted. These records allowed taxation, conscription, and resource allocation to be carried out with efficiency and fairness, minimizing the risk of unrest. In essence, the empire measured itself, not for control alone, but to maintain balance between the central authority and local realities. The bureaucracy also emphasized flexibility. Conquered regions retained certain laws, customs, and local officials, provided they acknowledged Mongol authority and contributed to the system of tribute. This approach minimized resistance and leveraged existing structures, integrating knowledge and expertise from diverse societies. Persia, Central Asia, and northern China each maintained their administrative traditions, now connected under a unified framework of oversight. The result was a complex but harmonious network that allowed the empire to function despite its extraordinary scale. Education and expertise were quietly valued within this system. Skilled scribes, engineers, and administrators were moved across regions as needed, sharing knowledge and best practices. Communication between courts, cities, and military units became a steady rhythm of reports and consultations. Decisions were made with evidence, observation, and local insight. In a sense, the empire itself became a living organism, learning from its parts and adapting over time. Military oversight was similarly integrated into governance. Commanders reported progress, coordinated supply lines, and advised on local conditions. The cavalry's mobility allowed them to respond quickly to disturbances, reinforcing administrative decisions with presence when needed. Siege engines, herds, and supply depots were all managed through this extended bureaucracy, blending traditional Mongol strengths with settled logistical practices. A calm discovery emerges. Connection does not require proximity, but coordination and trust. The Mongols demonstrated that even across deserts, mountains, and rivers, a realm could remain unified if its systems were designed to move as smoothly as its armies. Authority flowed through networks, rather than through personal presence, creating resilience and continuity. Religious and cultural diversity also shaped the bureaucracy. Governors were expected to respect local beliefs and practices, allowing multiple faiths and customs to coexist peacefully. Clerics, monks, and scholars traveled freely, often carrying letters of protection from the Khan himself. By integrating governance with tolerance, the Mongols strengthened loyalty and stability across far-flung territories. Through these systems, the empire grew confident in its ability to manage expansion. Its leaders could dispatch armies, collect tribute, and facilitate trade without micromanaging distant provinces. Regions once isolated now operated as interconnected nodes within a wider network. The empire was not held together merely by fear or force. It was bound by structure, communication, and shared responsibility. By the end of this period, the Mongol administration had achieved a remarkable balance. Authority centralized enough to maintain cohesion, yet flexible enough to respect the vast diversity of the territories it encompassed. The steppe-born empire now possessed the tools to govern cities, rivers, and civilizations with the same steady efficiency that had guided it across open plains. What happens when distant worlds can speak again? With the Mongol Empire firmly established across Asia, a remarkable transformation quietly took shape. The vast distances that had once separated civilizations, from the markets of Chang'an to the caravanserais of Samarkand, from the Caspian shores to the edges of Eastern Europe, now became traversable with unprecedented safety and reliability. The Mongols, who had once been feared as raiders, became guarantors of passage, orchestrating a calm and steady era of connectivity that scholars would later call the Pax Mongolica. At the heart of this period lay the Silk Roads, a network of trade routes older than most empires, yet long disrupted by local conflicts, banditry, and unstable borders. Under Mongol oversight, these routes were revitalized. Couriers traveled along the Yam system, carrying messages and intelligence, while merchants moved with caravans of silk, spices, silver, and textiles. Fortified way stations were built along the roads, offering rest, supplies, and protection. Travelers who had once feared robbery or arrest now found the journey both predictable and secure. In the quiet rhythm of caravan movement, distant lands began to reconnect. The Mongols understood the value of commerce as both practical and symbolic. Safe trade ensured wealth for the empire, yet it also reinforced political stability and fostered trust among conquered peoples. Caravanserais, scattered across deserts, steppes, and river valleys, became hubs not only for goods but for ideas. Merchants and travelers from China, Persia, India, and Europe exchanged languages, stories, and knowledge. Recipes, medicinal practices, technologies, and artistic motifs traveled alongside tangible commodities. The world, once fragmented, began to pulse with subtle interaction. One quiet discovery of this era was the role of communication in maintaining trust. Letters of passage, often sealed with the Khan's mark, allowed merchants and envoys to move with confidence across thousands of miles. These documents guaranteed protection, providing both legal and moral assurance that one would reach the next trading post safely. Such systems encouraged travel by reducing fear, reinforcing the perception that the Mongols were not merely conquerors but facilitators of exchange. The revival of trade routes brought economic prosperity to regions previously marginalized by distance or instability. Cities along the Silk Road flourished, their markets filling with goods from east and west. Persian merchants moved Chinese silks and porcelain, while Indian spices found their way into the kitchens of Central Asia. European traders, including envoys from Venice and Genoa, traveled eastward to reach the courts of Karakoram and beyond. In these calm, steady exchanges, commerce became a bridge between cultures, enabling the flow of wealth and ideas alike. Mongol oversight also fostered standardization and efficiency. Measures of weight and value were harmonized, tolls regulated, and disputes adjudicated impartially by appointed officials. This quiet predictability allowed merchants to plan journeys with confidence, ensuring that goods moved efficiently and safely. In effect, the empire became a single, interconnected economic organism, stretching from the Pacific to the edges of Europe. Beyond material exchange, the reopened Silk Roads encouraged intellectual and cultural dialogue. Scholars, artisans, and clerics traveled alongside merchants. Maps, astronomical knowledge, medical texts, and literary works circulated widely. The empire facilitated dialogue between Islamic, Chinese, and European worlds, not through formal treaties alone, but through the simple act of guaranteeing safe passage and fostering interaction. Ideas traveled as freely as silk and silver, enriching local cultures while knitting a sense of shared humanity across continents. In this context, the Mongols' reputation shifted. While the memory of conquest lingered, their role as guarantors of trade, stability, and communication became increasingly prominent. Travelers wrote of orderly relay stations, disciplined patrols, and the surprisingly efficient administration that allowed people from vastly different societies to interact peacefully. For many, the Mongol Empire became a conduit of calm reliability in a world long accustomed to disruption. The economic and cultural revival was not uniform, nor free from tension. Local rulers sometimes bristled at the imposition of Mongol oversight. Bandits still lurked on remote routes, and harsh climates tested caravans' endurance. Yet the Mongols' commitment to systemic stability, through patrols, way stations, and clear legal frameworks, mitigated these risks. Over time, travelers internalized a sense of predictability that allowed the Silk Roads to function as arteries of connection, nourishing the exchange of both goods and knowledge. Through these efforts, the Mongols revealed a subtle truth. Empire can create calm as well as conquest, and connectivity can be as transformative as victory in battle. By securing trade and communication, they made distant worlds legible to one another, not through coercion, but through infrastructure, oversight, and trust. This quiet interconnection reshaped societies along the route, enriching cities, spreading technologies, and fostering cultural understanding. By the end of this era, caravans moved steadily under the Mongol banner, and letters and goods flowed like gentle currents across Eurasia. Silk, spices, ideas, and people all traced the same paths, linking worlds that had once been strangers. In this calm revival of exchange, the Mongols created a framework in which commerce, culture, and diplomacy could coexist, laying the foundation for centuries of interaction between East and West. Exchange went beyond goods. Can diversity become a quiet strength? Within the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire, a remarkable feature quietly emerged alongside trade and administration: religious tolerance. Unlike many empires that sought to impose uniform belief, the Mongols approached faith with a measured curiosity and a practical openness. This was not mere policy, but a philosophy embedded in their understanding of the world, a recognition that diversity could serve as both a stabilizing force and a source of insight. The Mongols themselves held a range of spiritual beliefs. Shamanism, rooted in the rhythms of the steppe, emphasized harmony with nature, ancestors, and spirits. It provided guidance in matters both personal and communal, grounding decisions in observation of the natural world. As the empire expanded, the Mongols encountered Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and a myriad of local cults and traditions. Instead of seeking to replace them, they often welcomed these practices into the fold, providing protection and patronage while allowing communities to govern their own spiritual affairs. This approach had practical benefits. Religious communities could serve as bridges between the Mongol administration and local populations. Buddhist monasteries in Tibet, Muslim scholars in Central Asia, and Christian communities in the Rus principalities each became nodes of trust and cultural continuity. Their leaders communicated with the Mongol court, shared knowledge, and facilitated peaceful governance. By valuing diversity, The empire reinforced loyalty and stability across regions that might otherwise have resisted foreign rule. Karakoram, the Mongol capital, became a vivid symbol of this openness. Within its walls, one could encounter Buddhist monks from Tibet, Muslim merchants from Persia, Nestorian Christians from the West, and shamans of the steppe, all practicing side by side. Temples, mosques, and shrines coexisted, each attended and respected. This calm coexistence was maintained not by coercion, but by law. The Yasa emphasized protection of faith, prohibiting interference in others' religious practices while requiring respect and order. One subtle insight emerges from this period. Tolerance was a form of governance as much as morality. By permitting freedom of worship, the Mongols created social cohesion across vast distances. Religious leaders became intermediaries, helping to mediate disputes, advise rulers, and educate populations. Diversity became a network of quiet influence, a tool of diplomacy as well as spiritual expression. The empire also encouraged intellectual exchange. Scholars traveled widely, carrying texts, commentaries, and practices between regions. Buddhist sutras reached Persia, Islamic treatises appeared in China, and Christian manuscripts circulated from the Rus principalities to Central Asia. Ideas flowed along the same routes as silk and silver, illustrating that spiritual life could be as mobile and interconnected as commerce. In this way, tolerance nurtured not only coexistence but enrichment, expanding understanding across cultures and continents. At the local level, communities adapted pragmatically to Mongol oversight. Taxation and legal obligations were often separated from religious practice. Clerics could hold influence without threatening the authority of the Khan. Temples and mosques served as educational centers, sometimes preserving scientific knowledge, medical techniques, and literary works. This blending of spiritual and practical life contributed to the empire's intellectual vitality, creating a calm rhythm of coexistence rarely found in other empires of comparable size. Even in conflict zones, the Mongols maintained this philosophy. Cities that surrendered peacefully were allowed to continue their religious practices, sometimes receiving protection or exemption from taxes in exchange for loyalty. This policy reduced resistance, facilitated trade, and encouraged integration. Across Central Asia, China, Persia, and the Rus lands, faith became a bridge rather than a barrier, a quiet mechanism for empire building. Through this approach, the Mongols demonstrated a subtle truth. Strength does not always flow from uniformity or force. In the careful cultivation of tolerance, they discovered that diversity could enhance cohesion, enrich culture, and stabilize society. Faith, rather than being a source of division, became a quiet foundation on which the empire rested. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had transformed into a vast, interconnected space where ideas, beliefs, and practices moved as freely as merchants and armies. Pilgrimages, scholarly journeys, and diplomatic missions traversed its breadth, linking communities and fostering understanding. Religious tolerance, enforced through law and lived through daily practice, became a defining feature of the empire's character. Ideas began to travel, too. How far can a thought travel when roads are open? The Mongol Empire was not only a conduit for trade and faith. It became a vast network of ideas, scholarship, and technology. With secure roads, postal systems, and tolerant governance, knowledge could traverse the continent as readily as silk, horses, or spices. In this era, the empire acted as a kind of quiet intellectual circulation system, connecting minds across deserts, steppes, and rivers, and allowing insights from one corner of Eurasia to reach another with remarkable speed. At the heart of this network was the movement of texts and paper. Paper, already in use in China and Central Asia, became more widely available under Mongol protection, enabling bureaucracies, scholars, and merchants to document agreements, inventories, and observations. This facilitated administration and trade, but it also quietly democratized access to knowledge. Scribes could copy manuscripts, preserve medical treatises, or record astronomical observations, and those works could now travel along the empire's routes to distant regions. Printing technology, particularly in China, also gained indirect reach through the empire's networks. Woodblock printing and later innovations allowed books, religious texts, and maps to multiply beyond a single court or city. Scholars traveling to Karakoram or other major centers could consult manuscripts from Tibet, Persia, and China, exchanging ideas and learning from innovations far removed from their homelands. The Mongol road system ensured that these materials could arrive intact and relatively safely, making the circulation of knowledge a practical reality rather than a rare occurrence. Maps and geographical understanding flourished in this environment. Cartographers and travelers, some native, some foreign, documented rivers, deserts, and cities, creating reference works that enabled trade, diplomacy, and military planning. For instance, accounts by envoys like William of Rubruck or merchants moving between Persia and China contributed to a growing awareness of Eurasian geography. This quiet accumulation of understanding reshaped how people perceived the world, gradually connecting mental maps across continents. Science and technology traveled along similar routes. Mathematical concepts, astronomical tables, and engineering knowledge moved between cultures. Papermaking techniques from China reached Central Asia, Persian methods of irrigation and architecture informed northern China, and medical texts traveled from the Islamic world to the Mongol heartlands. These exchanges were not the result of coercion but of opportunity. Scholars, artisans, and clerics could operate within the Mongols' protective framework, allowing knowledge to diffuse organically. The Mongol postal system, yam stations, and mounted couriers served as the quiet bloodstream of this intellectual circulation. Orders, correspondence, and reports reached their destinations swiftly, but so too did ideas. Envoys and merchants often carried letters of introduction, recommendations, and scholarly texts. In effect, every journey became a potential vector for knowledge, blending observation, learning, and human connection. The empire's structure amplified the reach of thought, ensuring that discoveries could move farther and faster than ever before. Libraries and educational centers also benefited from this openness. While not large in the European sense, Mongol-supported institutions preserved manuscripts, provided space for copying texts, and offered access to travelers and scholars. Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, Islamic madrasas, and Chinese academies were all nodes in a larger intellectual network. Knowledge became portable, resilient, and widely distributed, a quiet revolution that complemented the empire's physical expansion. A subtle yet profound effect emerged: cross-cultural fertilization. Astronomical techniques from the Islamic world influenced Chinese observations. Chinese medical methods were applied in Persia, and European envoys brought new perspectives to the Mongol court. Ideas were not confined by borders. They flowed along the same roads as armies and caravans, moving through human networks and material infrastructure alike. In this calm circulation, the Mongol Empire became a conduit not only for goods but for the very instruments of thought. The circulation of knowledge also reinforced governance and commerce. Accurate maps improved trade and military planning. Copies of laws and treaties standardized administration across vast distances. Technical manuals enabled engineers and artisans to replicate practices in multiple regions. In this way, intellectual networks were practical as well as enlightening, quietly underpinning the empire's cohesion. Through these developments, one truth becomes clear: ideas, like people and goods, travel best when protected, respected, and supported by reliable infrastructure. The Mongols' unique combination of stability, tolerance, and communication created a framework in which knowledge could move with unprecedented fluidity. In this environment, a scholar's observation, a merchant's ledger, or a traveler's map could reach distant horizons, leaving subtle yet lasting impact on the world. By the mid-13th century, the empire had transformed into a sprawling, interlinked intellectual ecosystem. Paper, printing, maps, and correspondence were not just tools, they were lifelines of thought, connecting cultures, technologies, and people across Eurasia. The quiet strength of the Mongols lay not only in their armies, but in their capacity to open roads for ideas, allowing human understanding to circulate with a calm, persistent energy. What becomes of empire when distance becomes identity? In the decades following Ogidi Khan's death, the vast Mongol Empire began to fragment, not through sudden collapse, but through a quiet evolution of administration, geography, and circumstance. One of the most prominent regions to emerge from this process was the western segment of the empire, known to history as the Golden Horde. Stretching across the northern steppes, the Volga Basin, and into the Rus principalities, this Khanate developed a character distinct from the heartlands of Mongolia, blending nomadic traditions with the settled cultures it now governed. The Golden Horde owed its origins to Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis. Tasked with overseeing western campaigns and territories, Batu established a durable presence in the steppe, coordinating both military and administrative affairs. While the horde remained part of the greater Mongol system, distance naturally fostered autonomy. Local challenges, climates, and populations necessitated decision-making that could not wait for a central decree. Over time, this distance became a defining feature, allowing the Western Khanate to develop its own rhythm of governance, culture, and identity. Relations with the Rus principalities illustrate the subtleties of this autonomy. The Mongols did not simply conquer and occupy. They integrated local rulers into a system of tribute, oversight, and indirect authority. Princes retained their thrones in exchange for payment and loyalty, creating a dynamic that combined submission with continuity. Cities like Kiev and Vladimir became nodes in a larger network, paying taxes while maintaining internal structures. The horde's approach was pragmatic: control without micromanagement, influence without obliteration. This balance allowed commerce, administration, and daily life to continue even under distant rulers. The Golden Horde also absorbed cultural influences from its neighbors. Islamic, Turkic, and steppe traditions intermingled, giving rise to a blended identity that was both Mongol in origin and uniquely Western in character. Cities grew as centers of trade, religious practice, and scholarship. Caravan routes connected the horde to Persia, Central Asia, and the European frontier, carrying merchants, envoys, and ideas. Even as the Khanate preserved the Mongols' nomadic heritage, horses, mobility, and seasonal movement, it gradually incorporated elements of urban life, literacy, and settled governance. Military and administrative innovation continued quietly. The horde maintained cavalry-based forces capable of rapid response, yet relied heavily on local troops and levies from tributary cities. Communication across the vast territory depended on relay stations and trusted messengers, echoing the methods developed under Ogidi. Yet here, the techniques were adapted to the western steppe, reflecting both environment and population density. Distance encouraged both independence and ingenuity, allowing the Golden Horde to thrive as a semi-autonomous entity while still acknowledging its ties to the greater Mongol world. A subtle insight emerges from this period. Empire is not only about conquest, but also about adaptation. The Golden Horde exemplifies how regional circumstances, geography, and human networks shape the evolution of power. As the western steppes became increasingly its own world, the horde retained Mongol organizational principles while developing distinct political and cultural traits. Distance, rather than weakening authority, fostered a new identity that balanced heritage with local reality. Religious and cultural integration was a quiet strength. Islam gradually gained prominence, coexisting with shamanistic and Christian communities in the region. Trade and communication introduced artistic, literary, and technological influences from the East, blending with local traditions. The resulting cultural synthesis was subtle yet profound, creating a legacy that would endure for centuries along the Volga and beyond. By the mid-13th century, the Golden Horde had established itself as a stable, dynamic entity. Its cities, steppe territories, and tributary lands formed a network capable of governance, commerce, and defense. Though still connected to the broader Mongol framework, the Khanate had begun to chart a unique path, shaped by distance, adaptation, and intercultural exchange. Southward, another path unfolded. How can new soil reshape old roots? To the south of the Golden Horde, another Mongol Khanate began to take shape, the Ilkhanate encompassing Persia and neighboring regions. Unlike the northern steppes, these lands were deeply urbanized, steeped in millennia of Persian administration, literature, and religion. The arrival of Mongol authority did not erase these traditions. Rather, it created a fertile ground for transformation. Over decades, the Ilkhanate developed a distinctive identity, blending Mongol governance with Persian culture and the gradually dominant influence of Islam. Founded by Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, the Ilkhanate was established following campaigns that subdued the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and extended Mongol control into the Iranian plateau. Hulagu and his successors implemented the familiar Mongol administrative techniques, relay stations, census-taking, and delegated authority, while adapting them to the region's urban complexity. Persian bureaucrats were retained and integrated into governance, preserving local knowledge and legal traditions. This careful blending allowed the Ilkhanate to maintain order while absorbing the benefits of Mongol oversight, security, communication, and coordination across vast distances. Religion played a central role in the Ilkhanate's evolution. Initially, the Mongols were shamanistic and tolerant, respecting local faiths. Over time, however, Islam gradually became dominant among the ruling elite, providing both a unifying framework and a bridge to the local population. Scholars, clerics, and jurists were welcomed, and Islamic institutions flourished under Mongol patronage. This process was gradual, a quiet integration rather than abrupt imposition. It allowed the Mongols to anchor themselves in the spiritual and cultural life of Persia, fostering loyalty and social cohesion while retaining the flexibility that had characterized their empire elsewhere. Alongside religion, the Ilkhanate became a hub of artistic and intellectual flourishing. Persian miniature painting, architecture, and literature blended Mongol motifs with traditional styles, producing works of subtle innovation. Scholars translated texts, preserved historical chronicles, and documented astronomical, medical, and geographic knowledge. Cities such as Tabriz and Moraga became centers of learning and culture, where libraries, observatories, and workshops facilitated the flow of ideas. In these calm exchanges, the Mongols acted as facilitators of creativity, enabling local traditions to thrive in new forms. Economically, the Ilkhanate benefited from secure trade routes and the Pax Mongolica. Caravans traveled safely from Central Asia to the Middle East, carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and manuscripts. Urban markets flourished, artisans prospered, and agricultural lands were carefully managed under the guidance of Mongol administrators and Persian experts. This integration of nomadic oversight and settled expertise created stability and prosperity, demonstrating the empire's ability to adapt governance to the needs of diverse societies. The Ilkhanate also illustrates a subtle principle of empire. Integration, when approached with respect and adaptation, strengthens authority without erasing identity. Mongol rulers maintained ultimate control, but they relied on local knowledge, faith, and artistry to embed themselves within the social fabric. Over time, Mongol and Persian identities intertwined, producing a hybrid culture that influenced architecture, literature, and administration for generations. By the late 13th century, the Ilkhanate had matured into a coherent, vibrant polity. It was a place where Mongol organization met Persian sophistication, where new beliefs and old traditions coexisted, and where intellectual and artistic life thrived under the quiet stability provided by centralized but adaptable governance. The Khanate demonstrated that conquest could be more than the assertion of power. It could be the foundation for lasting cultural and administrative transformation. Can a center hold when pulled in every direction? Nestled between the vast steppes of the north and the fertile plains of Persia and China, the Chagatai Khanate occupied a land both central and contested, bridging east and west. Named after Chagatai, the second son of Genghis Khan, this Khanate became a place of negotiation between tradition and adaptation. It was neither fully nomadic nor entirely urbanized, but a hybrid world where mobility, commerce, and culture intersected, producing both opportunity and tension. From the outset, the Chagatai lands presented unique challenges. stretching from the fertile Fergana Valley to the highlands of the Tian Shan and the deserts of Central Asia. The region hosted a diverse population of Turkic tribes, settled farmers, and urban merchants. Maintaining cohesion required a careful balance. The Mongols' traditional steppe-based authority, reliant on mobility and military discipline, had to coexist with sedentary societies accustomed to local rule and taxation. Governors and tribal leaders were entrusted with delegated authority. Yet the central Khan retained ultimate oversight, creating a dynamic of shared power across a patchwork of peoples. Cultural and religious diversity defined the Khanate. While initially shamanistic traditions persisted among Mongol elites, Islamic influence grew steadily among local populations. This gradual integration of faith created a nuanced political landscape, where tolerance and adaptation were tools of governance. The Chagatai Khanate thus became a laboratory in which Mongol methods of rule were tested against complex demographic realities, requiring flexibility, negotiation, and compromise. Economically, the region benefited from its position at the crossroads of Eurasia. Caravans carried silk, spices, and precious metals along routes that linked China with Persia and the Rus lands. Trade hubs and oasis towns flourished, facilitating the exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas. The Mongols' protection of these routes ensured stability, but it also demanded coordination and oversight. Local leaders administered taxes, managed resources, and maintained law, while the Khanate provided the overarching framework that kept commerce flowing. Military organization reflected similar balance. The Chagatai forces retained steppe mobility, relying on cavalry and seasonal movements, yet they also incorporated siegecraft, fortified garrisons, and alliances with local powers. This dual approach allowed the Khanate to defend its heartlands while supporting campaigns further afield. The region's terrain and strategic location required constant attention, as pressures came simultaneously from neighboring khanates, internal factions, and external threats. A subtle insight emerges from this period. Centrality does not guarantee stability, but adaptability does. The Chagatai Khanate survived and prospered by negotiating between competing influences, blending Mongol heritage with local customs, and integrating diverse populations into a flexible administrative and social framework. This careful equilibrium illustrates how empire can endure in places of tension when governance is both structured and responsive. Cultural life, too, reflected this blending. Artistic styles, literary forms, and architectural motifs combined steppe sensibilities with Persian, Turkic, and Chinese influences. Scholars, merchants, and clerics moved along the Khanate's networks, creating a steady flow of knowledge, ideas, and cultural expression. In this way, the region became not only a strategic hub, but also a center of intellectual and artistic exchange. By the mid-13th century, the Chagatai Khanate had carved a distinctive identity within the fragmented Mongol world. It was a space where tradition met adaptation, where mobility balanced urban sophistication, and where diverse communities coexisted under a framework of delegated authority and tolerant governance. The Khanate exemplified the delicate art of maintaining cohesion in a contested center, demonstrating that even a land pulled in many directions could achieve equilibrium through thoughtful administration and cultural integration. Far to the east, a different destiny emerged. How does an unstoppable force meet stillness? As the Mongol Empire expanded westward, its armies reached the fertile lands of the Middle East, a region long shaped by dynasties, trade networks, and religious institutions. Syria and Egypt, with their historic cities and strategic positions, became the stage for a quiet confrontation between two forms of power: the mobile, sweeping might of the Mongols, and the disciplined, entrenched strength of the Mamluks. Unlike distant provinces that submitted to Mongol rule with relative ease, these lands resisted, demonstrating that geography, organization, and local knowledge could counter even the most formidable force. The Mamluks, originally slave soldiers who had risen to political and military prominence in Egypt, had forged a society structured around training, discipline, and loyalty. They governed with careful coordination, maintaining fortified cities and controlling key trade routes. Their strategic acumen, combined with deep knowledge of local terrain and climate, allowed them to anticipate and counter the Mongol cavalry's usual advantages. In 1260, at the pivotal Battle of Ain Jalut, the Mongols, experienced, mobile, and formidable, met a well-prepared, disciplined opposition that could absorb, redirect, and ultimately halt their advance. This encounter illustrates a subtle truth about power. Mobility and strength alone cannot guarantee conquest. The Mamluks' success was as much about careful preparation, adaptive tactics, and understanding the environment as it was about martial skill. Their victories were quiet, measured, and deliberate, not sensational displays of force, but methodical defense executed with precision. The Mongols, despite their previous triumphs across vast regions, encountered a stillness they could not sweep aside. The Mongol campaigns in Syria and Egypt also reveal the limits imposed by climate and logistics. Arid plains, deserts, and narrow river valleys constrained cavalry maneuvers. Supply lines stretched thin, and unfamiliar terrain demanded adaptation. The Mamluks, accustomed to local conditions, exploited these factors, channeling Mongol movements into prepared zones of engagement. Geography, in effect, became a silent ally, reinforcing human strategy and amplifying the advantages of settled knowledge. Beyond the battlefield, the encounter had diplomatic and economic dimensions. The Mamluks maintained relationships with neighboring states and city-states, creating networks of support and intelligence. Cities such as Damascus, Cairo, and Aleppo provided safe harbors and logistical resources, enabling the Mamluks to sustain resistance over time. Trade and urban infrastructure were not simply passive backdrops. They were active components in the defense and governance of the region. Culturally, the Mongol-Mamluk interaction was more complex than simple opposition. Envoys, scholars, and merchants moved cautiously between territories, sharing knowledge even amidst tension. While military campaigns dominated the narrative, the quiet transmission of ideas, texts, and practices continued, illustrating that conflict did not entirely halt intellectual or cultural exchange. Even resistance can coexist with continuity, providing layers of nuance to the historical record. A subtle discovery of this period lies in the interplay between force and restraint. The Mongols' westward expansion was halted not by collapse but by measured opposition, local expertise, and the resilience of entrenched societies. The Mamluks exemplified the principle that strength is as much about organization, preparation, and adaptation as it is about numbers or speed. In the calm aftermath of battle, the lands continued to thrive, with cities and trade routes remaining intact, demonstrating the resilience of societies under pressure. By the mid-13th century, the encounter between Mongols and Mamluks had permanently shaped the western limits of the empire. Egypt and Syria remained independent, and the Mongol tide receded, redirecting the empire's energies elsewhere. The Mamluks' ability to hold ground exemplified the delicate balance between expansion and resistance, showing that even a seemingly unstoppable force must contend with geography, culture, and disciplined organization. Elsewhere, nature posed its own barriers. Can ambition cross every boundary? Beyond the vast plains of Eurasia, the Mongols turned their gaze toward distant waters, seeking to extend their reach to islands across the sea. Japan and Java, separated from the continental mainland by treacherous waters, became unexpected tests of the empire's limits. Unlike the steppe, where mobility and cavalry reigned supreme, maritime campaigns demanded patience, adaptation, and an understanding of forces far beyond human control. In these endeavors, the Mongols discovered that not all boundaries could be traversed by will or force alone. In 1274, a Mongol fleet assembled to reach Japan, carrying soldiers, horses, and supplies across the Tsushima Strait. The campaign relied on meticulous planning. Ships were constructed along the Chinese and Korean coasts, provisions were stockpiled, and coordination attempted across diverse territories. Yet, despite careful preparation, the Mongols faced challenges that were unfamiliar and immutable. Storms battered the fleet, unfamiliar tides disrupted navigation, and logistical complexity strained communication. The initial landing met with resistance from Japanese defenders, and retreat became inevitable. A second attempt, decades later, encountered similar natural obstacles, with typhoons famously scattering the fleet and leaving the Mongols to reconsider their strategy. Far to the south, the islands of Java presented another set of challenges. In the late 13th century, Mongol forces sought to intervene in local political struggles, projecting their authority across seas and dense tropical landscapes. Here, too, distance, climate, and geography tested the limits of steppe-based military methods. Swamps, monsoon rains, and complex river systems slowed campaigns, while local rulers and militias mounted determined, localized resistance. The lessons were subtle but profound. Mobility and organization on land did not automatically translate to success at sea or in tropical environments. These maritime campaigns offer insight into the quiet adaptability of the Mongols. While defeat at Japan and difficulty in Java curtailed expansion, they did not shatter the empire's strategic vision. Instead, the Mongols refined their approach, recognizing the importance of environmental knowledge, local alliances, and logistical planning in settings unlike the steppe. In this way, failures were absorbed as learning experiences, shaping future decisions and tempering ambitions with practical understanding. The psychological dimension of these campaigns is also notable. Mongol leadership faced the humbling realization that human planning alone could not control every variable. Storms, tides, and local resistance revealed the limits of power, teaching restraint and patience. Such experiences, though less dramatic than victories on land, contributed to the empire's broader administrative and strategic sophistication. Leaders came to value reconnaissance, alliance building, and flexible timing, lessons that quietly reinforced the empire's resilience in other theaters. Cultural exchange continued even amid these setbacks. Japanese and Javanese observers recorded accounts of Mongol forces, while Mongol envoys returned with knowledge of local politics, geography, and maritime practices. Shipbuilding techniques, navigational methods, and intelligence-gathering strategies were shared and adapted. The campaigns, though unsuccessful, became conduits for learning, expanding the empire's understanding of environments far removed from the steppes. One subtle discovery emerges. Even in failure, connectivity and observation can produce long-term gains. The Mongols' maritime campaigns reinforced the limits of force while highlighting the potential for knowledge, adaptation, and diplomacy. By respecting local conditions and learning from setbacks, they preserved resources and recalibrated strategy, demonstrating a quiet pragmatism that often goes unnoticed in narratives focused solely on conquest. By the early 14th century, the Mongols had accepted that Japan would remain beyond their reach, and that Southeast Asia required a different, more cautious approach. Yet these campaigns were not without value. They extended the empire's awareness, fostered regional intelligence networks, and reinforced the understanding that ambition must meet reality. Across seas and islands, lessons were learned about environment, logistics, and the limits of even the most formidable power. Resistance also grew within. How do old roots emerge beneath new rule? Across the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire, the rhythm of daily life often continued beneath the shadow of imperial authority. While Mongol armies and administrators provided order, local cultures quietly persisted, adapting, blending, and sometimes reasserting their autonomy. Over time, these subtle expressions of identity began to shape the character of the empire, demonstrating that conquest could coexist with continuity, and that even under foreign dominion, communities retained a quiet strength. In the western steppes, the Rus principalities slowly integrated Mongol tribute obligations into their own governance. While paying taxes and acknowledging the authority of the Golden Horde, princes preserved traditional titles, religious structures, and civic practices. Orthodox Christianity remained central to social and cultural life, shaping festivals, education, and moral frameworks. Similarly, in Persia under the Ilkhanate, Islamic traditions persisted and grew, even as Mongol rulers adapted to local customs and governance. Religious observances, scholarly networks, and architectural styles reflected centuries of Persian heritage, flourishing under the protective, but foreign umbrella of Mongol authority. Central Asia, within the Chagatai Khanate, displayed a delicate balance between steppe traditions and the settled practices of oasis towns and agricultural communities. Turkic languages, customs, and trade networks coexisted with Mongol administrative methods. Local elites mediated between imperial demands and community needs, ensuring that daily life, commerce, and religious practice continued with minimal disruption. In this region, old roots were not erased but carefully woven into the fabric of Mongol governance, preserving cultural memory even as political authority shifted. These patterns were mirrored in other regions as well. In China, the Yuan dynasty maintained Mongol rule at the top, yet local Chinese bureaucrats, artisans, and scholars played central roles in administration, culture, and economy. Confucian rituals, literary traditions, and educational systems persisted, coexisting with Mongol preferences for steppe-inspired law and military hierarchy. Across Eurasia, the empire created space for continuity, allowing communities to flourish quietly even under overarching imperial structures. Trade and communication networks, while initially designed to consolidate Mongol authority, also facilitated cultural resilience. Caravan routes, postal stations, and urban centers became spaces where local languages, religious practices, and customs endured. Merchants, travelers, and scholars carried these traditions alongside goods and information, ensuring that regional identities were not only preserved but also transmitted across generations. The Mongols' emphasis on stability and security inadvertently nurtured a diversity of cultural life. This resurgence of local identity illustrates a subtle but profound insight. The endurance of culture often depends on adaptability and coexistence, rather than confrontation or suppression. Mongol rulers recognized that stability required acknowledging the knowledge, practices, and authority of local communities. By allowing autonomy in cultural and social matters, the empire maintained cohesion while permitting the quiet flowering of regional traditions. Over time, these localized identities became more pronounced, shaping the long-term evolution of the empire's territories. Even in art, literature, and science, the reassertion of local influence was evident. Persian miniatures, Chinese architectural innovations, and Central Asian oral traditions continued to develop, blending with Mongol patronage but rooted firmly in pre-existing cultural soil. Local identities became the enduring undercurrent beneath the vast expanse of imperial administration, shaping memory, practice, and historical trajectory. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, it was clear that the Mongol Empire, though still formidable in organization and reach, had become a mosaic of distinct polities and cultures. Authority remained centralized in name, yet daily life reflected centuries-old customs, traditions, and beliefs that continued to shape human experience. In the quiet interplay between imperial power and local identity, the empire learned a subtle lesson. Governance and culture could coexist, and old roots could emerge beneath new rule, guiding communities through continuity and adaptation. How does silence signal the beginning of an ending? By the early 14th century, the Mongol Empire, once unified under the vision of Genghis Khan, began to feel the quiet pressures of its own vastness. The extraordinary mobility and cohesion that had enabled conquest across continents now faced the limits of distance, communication, and human endurance. Administrators and local leaders worked tirelessly to maintain order, relay messages, and enforce tribute. Yet over time, the machinery of governance began to show subtle signs of strain. Factionalism emerged within ruling families and military elites, quietly undermining unity. Succession disputes, rivalry among descendants, and competition for coveted positions created tensions that were often more corrosive than outright rebellion. The chain of command, once clear and disciplined, became a network of competing loyalties, where decisions were delayed or subverted by personal ambition. These tensions were compounded by the empire's sheer size. The further from the imperial center, the more autonomy, and occasionally defiance, regional khans exercised. Administrative fatigue also took root. Maintaining relay stations, census records, taxation systems, and law enforcement across thousands of miles required constant vigilance. Couriers, scribes, and governors faced the same challenges that armies did on the steppes: distance, weather, and the unpredictability of human cooperation. Even with Mongol ingenuity and local collaboration, sustaining a uniform system became increasingly difficult. Mistakes and delays crept in, subtly eroding the efficiency that had made the empire remarkable. Economic and social pressures amplified these strains. Trade networks, once a source of stability and wealth, occasionally faltered due to regional disputes, shifting alliances, or environmental challenges. Local populations, while generally compliant, occasionally resisted heavy taxation or administrative interference. In some regions, reliance on tribute without consistent oversight allowed gaps in governance, while in others, ambitious local rulers began consolidating power independently, testing the limits of central authority. Yet much of this decline unfolded in quiet increments rather than dramatic collapse. Unlike sudden invasions or catastrophic defeats, the weakening of central control was gradual, almost imperceptible to those living within the empire's expanse. Administrators continued to perform their duties, armies still marched when needed, and trade carried on. It was the accumulation of small inefficiencies, personal ambitions, and local adaptations that slowly reshaped the Mongol world, eroding the bonds that had once held it together. A subtle discovery of this period lies in the interplay between mobility and cohesion. The very flexibility that allowed Mongol forces to conquer vast regions, the ability to move quickly, adapt to terrain, and delegate authority, also created vulnerability. Distance, which once facilitated rapid expansion, now allowed regional autonomy to grow unchecked. Messages arrived slowly, loyalties shifted quietly, and local identities, strengthened under decades of indirect rule, began asserting themselves with greater confidence. The empire's strengths had become its quiet limitations. In this context, it is easy to see how silence can signal change. There were no immediate disasters, no dramatic collapse, yet the absence of frictionless communication, the growing weight of administration, and the subtle erosion of authority all indicated that transformation was underway. Where once the Mongols had moved like a single organism across continents, they now operated as a series of interconnected, but increasingly independent parts, each influenced by local circumstance, ambition, and environment. By the early 14th century, the contours of decline were clear. The Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan Dynasty in China each faced pressures unique to their regions, shaped by geography, culture, and internal dynamics. The empire was no longer a single, unified entity but a constellation of polities linked by shared heritage, common history, and residual loyalty to Mongol traditions. The quiet strain of overextension and administrative fatigue had begun to reshape the map of Eurasia, laying the groundwork for further transformation. What happens when an empire no longer feels like home? In the eastern reaches of the Mongol Empire, the Yuan Dynasty in China faced a gradual unraveling that reflected both internal strain and cultural distance. The Mongol rulers, though heirs of Genghis Khan's vision, governed a society vastly different from the steppe, one with deep traditions, dense population centers, and highly developed bureaucratic systems. Over decades, the gulf between imperial authority and local society widened, and the dynasty began to lose the legitimacy that once commanded obedience. Early Yuan rulers had relied on a combination of Mongol military prestige and existing Chinese administrative frameworks to consolidate power. Local officials and scholars were integrated into governance, trade and agriculture thrived under stable oversight, and the empire projected authority across vast distances. Yet over time, this delicate balance faltered. Corruption crept into bureaucracy, taxation became heavier to support military campaigns and lavish court spending, and resentment quietly built among peasants and urban populations. The empire, once a source of security and prosperity, increasingly felt alien to those it ruled. Natural disasters further exacerbated the dynasty's vulnerability. Floods, droughts, and famines affected agricultural production, placing strain on both local communities and the imperial treasury. Relief efforts were often slow or uneven, undermining confidence in the state's ability to provide protection and stability. These events were not sudden catastrophes but ongoing pressures that gradually eroded trust and loyalty, revealing how fragile legitimacy can become when governance is stretched across cultural and geographic divides. Peasant unrest grew as a natural response to these pressures. Local uprisings, often small and sporadic at first, reflected centuries-old patterns of resistance to heavy taxation and unresponsive authority. Over time, these disturbances coalesced into organized movements, drawing strength from discontent and a desire for local control. Rebels appealed not only to immediate grievances but also to shared cultural identity, reminding both rulers and subjects that legitimacy rests upon connection, respect, and the recognition of local norms. The Mongol elite, accustomed to command through loyalty, discipline, and mobility, struggled to adapt to the unique social dynamics of China. Attempts to impose steppe-based practices on a dense, literate, and highly organized society often backfired. Administrative decrees, military conscription, and court rituals could alienate rather than unify, producing a sense that the Yuan dynasty was an outsider in the land it governed. Gradually, this perception undermined the cohesion necessary for long-term rule. By the mid-14th century, the Yuan court faced mounting pressure on multiple fronts: fiscal strain, popular unrest, local rebellions, and the persistent challenge of maintaining authority across vast, culturally distinct territories. The dynasty's retreat was not sudden but cumulative. Gradually, the Mongol rulers withdrew from political centers, eventually leaving China to be reunited under native leadership, marking the end of Yuan rule. The empire, which had once felt like a vehicle for uniting East and West, no longer resonated as home. A subtle lesson emerges from the fall of the Yuan. An empire's strength depends as much on legitimacy and integration as on force or administration. Military prowess and organizational skill cannot fully substitute for connection to the people and land one governs. In the case of Yuan China, alienation, slow adaptation, and social discontent quietly undermined authority, demonstrating that even the most expansive and disciplined states are vulnerable when their rule feels imposed rather than shared. By the 1360s, the Yuan dynasty had effectively lost control of China. Mongol rulers retreated northward, leaving behind cities, traditions, and administrative structures that would continue to influence Chinese history. The empire endured in memory and legacy, yet its presence in the Middle Kingdom became a chapter of the past, a reminder of both ambition and limitation. Do empires end, or do they simply change shape? Across the vast steppes, far from the cities of China and Persia, the Mongol Empire's once unified authority gradually dissolved into a constellation of independent polities. The Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the remnants of the Yuan dynasty had already begun to follow their own trajectories, shaped by local conditions, rulers, and shifting allegiances. What remained of the empire was no longer a single, sweeping force, but a network of culturally distinct domains, each retaining fragments of Mongol governance and military organization, yet increasingly autonomous. This dispersal was not marked by dramatic battles or catastrophic collapse. Instead, it unfolded quietly. As regional leaders assumed greater control, local dynasties emerged, and the once centralized authority of the Khan waned. Administrative structures persisted in modified forms, trade and communication continued, and the memory of Mongol cohesion remained influential. Yet the empire's core characteristic, its ability to operate as a single, coordinated force spanning continents, had eroded. Distance, local ambition, and the natural evolution of societies had quietly reshaped the political landscape. The process of fragmentation revealed the resilience of local identity and the limits of mobility as a binding force. In the western steppes, the Golden Horde maintained influence over the Rus lands, yet it gradually adapted to local norms and alliances, blending Mongol traditions with emerging regional power structures. In Persia, the Ilkhanate's successors experienced similar transitions, integrating more fully into the Islamic world while maintaining faint traces of Mongol heritage. Across Central Asia, Chagatai successors negotiated between steppe traditions and the needs of settled communities, sustaining governance without imperial centrality. Even in areas where Mongol military and administrative structures persisted, the empire's symbolic unity began to fade. Khans were increasingly local rulers rather than supreme overlords. The rituals, laws, and traditions established under Genghis Khan remained, but they were interpreted and enforced according to regional circumstances. Military campaigns were smaller, more localized, and often defensive rather than expansive. The empire's heartbeat, once synchronized across thousands of miles, now pulsed unevenly, echoing the contours of diverse lands and peoples. This quiet transformation also allowed for cultural flowering and adaptation. Local courts, merchants, and scholars continued to benefit from the networks and stability established under Mongol rule. Trade routes remained active, cities prospered, and intellectual exchange persisted. In many ways, the empire's dispersal created space for new identities and innovations, illustrating that the end of political unity does not erase influence or achievement. Indeed, the Mongols' organizational, military, and administrative legacies continued to shape Eurasian history for centuries. A subtle insight emerges from this period. Empires rarely vanish entirely. They transform. The Mongol Empire did not end with a sudden collapse but rather evolved into a mosaic of powers, leaving behind patterns of governance, trade, cultural exchange, and mobility that would inform successor states. The steppe itself returned to a quieter rhythm, dotted with nomadic communities and regional khanates. Yet the memory of its sweeping authority remained embedded in landscapes, chronicles, and institutions. By the late 14th century, what had been the largest contiguous empire in human history existed more as a constellation of influence than as a unified entity. The roads, relay stations, and administrative structures endured in fragments. The stories of conquest and governance survived in texts and oral memory, and the Mongol imprint remained tangible in the territories they had once bound together. The empire's end was thus a quiet, reflective transformation, a return to dispersed polities guided by local conditions, yet indelibly shaped by decades of unprecedented connectivity and coordination. How far can a life ripple through time? The Mongol Empire, though politically fragmented centuries ago, continues to leave subtle traces upon the lands and peoples of Eurasia. One of the most tangible legacies can be found in genetics and demography, where the movements of armies, migrants, and settlers have left a measurable imprint. Modern studies of Y chromosome patterns and population genetics reveal clusters linked to Genghis Khan and his close male descendants, illustrating how one individual's lineage, amplified through a vast empire, can echo quietly across generations. Migration and settlement patterns under Mongol rule also shaped geography in enduring ways. Steppe herders spread into new valleys, riverside towns flourished along caravan routes, and previously marginal regions became centers of trade and interaction. The Mongols' establishment of postal systems, garrison towns, and administrative hubs created points of human settlement that often persisted long after the empire itself receded. Across Central Asia, Persia, China, and Eastern Europe, the routes carved by Mongol armies became highways of commerce, communication, and cultural exchange, leaving an imprint on the landscapes both physical and human. Population shifts were influenced not only by conquest but also by strategic resettlement. Skilled artisans, scholars, and administrators were often relocated to serve imperial projects, fostering the diffusion of knowledge and culture. Cities and regions that received these migrants became centers of innovation, blending local practices with ideas imported from distant lands. Over decades, these movements subtly altered demographics, reinforcing the interconnectedness that had defined Mongol administration and trade networks. Beyond genetics and settlement, the empire's reach shaped the rhythms of daily life for countless communities. Herding patterns, agricultural practices, and urban layouts adapted to Mongol needs and oversight, and in some cases persisted into later centuries. Even as political authority faded, the structures established for coordination, security, and logistics remained embedded in human geography, influencing economic and social patterns long after the Khans had vanished from power. These influences remind us that legacy is cumulative and often invisible. While battles, rulers, and treaties may dominate historical narratives, the quiet movements of people, the pathways of migration, and the spread of genes and ideas illustrate a softer, enduring power. The Mongol Empire, through its demographic and geographic imprint, demonstrates how human life ripples far beyond immediate events, subtly shaping the possibilities of future generations. This chapter of genetic and geographic impact also invites reflection on human interconnectedness. The lines traced by Mongol expansion reveal networks of kinship, culture, and commerce that bridged vast distances, illustrating the power of movement, adaptation, and endurance. Even today, the echoes of those centuries of mobility remind us that history is not only recorded in texts or monuments but also carried in bodies, in landscapes, and in the shared patterns of human settlement. How does memory rewrite history's tone? The Mongol Empire story has long been shaped by the perspectives of those who lived under its shadow, as well as by generations of historians interpreting its legacy. Early narratives, often written by victims of conquest or chroniclers of invaded lands, emphasize destruction, plunder, and terror. Cities burned, populations displaced, and political structures overturned. These accounts, preserved in chronicles and oral traditions, cast the Mongols as a force of sudden and overwhelming disruption. Yet as time passed, historians and scholars began to reconsider these portrayals, revealing a more nuanced picture of an empire that also facilitated trade, cultural exchange, and administrative innovation. From China to Persia, from the Rus principalities to Central Asia, local memory shaped the story of Mongol rule. In some regions, destruction was indeed a reality, particularly during campaigns of initial conquest. Yet even in areas that experienced devastation, reconstruction often followed rapidly, supported by Mongol policies of stability, taxation, and urban protection. Markets reopened, religious communities received tolerance, and communication networks allowed commerce and scholarship to resume. Over generations, these examples tempered the narrative of relentless destruction, highlighting an empire that, while formidable in war, also nurtured continuity and adaptation. Scholars have increasingly emphasized the Mongols' role in connecting the Eurasian continent. The safety of the Silk Roads under Mongol oversight facilitated exchanges of goods, technologies, and ideas across thousands of miles. Paper, printing, medical knowledge, astronomical observation, and artistic traditions traveled with merchants, envoys, and scholars, often in quiet ways that left lasting cultural imprints. These achievements, once overshadowed by tales of conquest, are now appreciated as a testament to the Mongols' capacity for innovation and integration. Historical debate also engages with the empire's governance and legal structures. The Yasa, administrative delegation, and merit-based leadership practices illustrate a sophisticated understanding of mobility, diversity, and societal organization. While not always uniformly applied or perfectly preserved in documentation, these systems contributed to the empire's ability to maintain cohesion across vast distances. Modern historians examine these frameworks not merely as tools of control, but as early examples of organizational ingenuity capable of sustaining complex, multi-ethnic states. Cultural echoes persist beyond policy and scholarship. Literature, art, and oral traditions recorded both fear and admiration. Persian poets memorialized the might of Mongol rulers while reflecting on human resilience. Chinese historians noted both disruption and innovation. Across Central Asia, steppe traditions absorbed elements of Mongol law and administration into local practice. Even today, museums, manuscripts, and archaeological sites offer tangible reminders of a civilization that, while no longer politically unified, left a lasting imprint on Eurasian culture. This evolving interpretation underscores a subtle insight. Memory and perspective shape the enduring tone of history. Initial impressions of violence and conquest are complemented by longer-term observations of continuity, adaptation, and influence. In understanding the Mongols, one sees not only an empire of force but also a conduit of connectivity and cultural transformation. Their legacy is neither wholly destructive nor purely constructive, but a complex interplay of both, reflecting the multifaceted nature of human history. By tracing these debates, listeners are invited to reflect on how historical narratives are formed, revised, and transmitted. The Mongol Empire teaches that events can be remembered differently across time and space, depending on perspective, evidence, and interpretation. This awareness deepens appreciation for both the tangible and intangible traces left by a civilization, offering a calm, contemplative view of the past that values both caution and admiration. When the hoofbeats fade, what quiet remains? As centuries passed, the vast steppe grew still beneath skies that had once echoed with the thunder of Mongol cavalry. The hoofbeats that carried armies across continents softened into memory, and the wide expanses of grass, rivers, and mountains reclaimed their quiet rhythm. Yet in this calm, traces of the empire endure, not in the roar of conquest, but in the subtle shaping of landscapes, cultures, and human networks. The Mongols' imprint lingers in the pathways they opened, the cities they fostered, and the knowledge they transported, a gentle reminder of human ambition intertwined with the rhythms of nature. The steppe itself offers a meditation on impermanence. Nomadic societies rose and fell, yet the land endured, its seasonal cycles continuing regardless of dynasties or empires. Herds moved in harmony with weather and terrain. Rivers carved new channels, and winds scattered seeds across distant valleys. In observing these rhythms, one understands the Mongols' world as a dialogue between human endeavor and the environment. Their mastery of mobility, adaptation, and coordination reflected a deep attunement to natural cycles, a wisdom that persists quietly in our understanding of nomadic life. Even as political unity dissolved, the empire's influence persisted in culture, trade, and memory. Caravan routes continued to link cities, artistic and literary traditions flourished under hybrid influences, and local polities carried forward administrative lessons from Mongol governance. Generations later, the echoes of these innovations could be seen in Eurasian cities, roads, and knowledge networks. The Mongol Empire, though no longer intact, left a lattice of human connections spanning continents, a testament to the endurance of organization, vision, and movement. There is also a gentle lesson in human impermanence. The very leaders who once commanded thousands, and whose names are now etched into history, return to the earth, leaving behind not monuments of stone alone but legacies woven into society, landscape, and memory. Temujin, Ogidi, Kublai, and others are remembered not merely for battles or conquests, but for the structures, laws, and pathways they created, reminders that influence can persist beyond life, even as the immediacy of power fades. This final reflection emphasizes continuity in subtle ways. Languages evolved, trade continued, religious and cultural traditions intertwined, and landscapes bore traces of human movement. In many ways, the quiet endurance of these systems forms a legacy far more profound than the fleeting noise of war. The empire's story is not concluded in collapse, but in transformation, its essence absorbed into the world it once spanned, leaving a calm but indelible mark. Perhaps the most poignant insight lies in the convergence of movement and stillness. The Mongols' world was defined by motion. Armies, herds, caravans, and envoys traversed immense distances. Yet with time, motion gave way to stillness, and the lessons of mobility, adaptation, and connection became embedded in human memory. To reflect on the steppe today is to witness that same balance. The quiet landscape carrying the weight of history, the echoes of hoofbeats present in thought and imagination rather than sound. As the sun sets over grasslands and mountains, one senses a continuity that transcends political boundaries. The Mongol Empire, vast and ephemeral, reminds us that human endeavors are part of a larger rhythm, a story of ambition, adaptation, and enduring influence. Its legacy is both visible and invisible. In trade routes, in governance, in the blended cultures of Eurasia, and in the quiet imagination of those who remember and study it. A gentle final settling into silence. As our journey across the endless steppe comes to rest, Take a moment to reflect on the subtle ways history continues to shape the world around us. If this quiet exploration of the Mongols brought you calm, curiosity, or new insight, consider subscribing to our channel for more journeys through lost worlds, empires, and ancient peoples, each told with care, accuracy, and a soothing narrative to guide your mind as you unwind. Settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let the echoes of the past carry you gently into your own thoughts or into sleep. And if you'd like to revisit the paths of empires, the rise of civilizations, or the whispers of history, explore our playlists below and continue your Nightfall journey through time.